Look at that. Hi.
Hi, Mummy.
Guys,
Can I?
of course you can. You just gotta be calm. You are scratchy. I can get Of course I'm going to take you. I'm grabbing.
I think when the second one came in, there's a benchmark for the first. It's like, how much better could this get? And then it did.
Don't jump out my hand. I still can't make my mind up. Not had the conversation yet about. I'm intrigued to hear your views on this. Do it. Say it.
Puppy two.
Puppy two.
I think that's kind of where I'm leaning, but it's a group decision.
Yeah, it's
isn't
a
it?
decision.
Absolutely.
Please, can I hold her?
Not just yet, Ellie.
Why?
Because she doesn't belong to us yet.
Hiya.
So you've come in the search for a dog.
I am. I'm looking for a new friend.
Okay.
I've wanted a dog for a long time. Like, I just love dogs generally.
Okay.
But I always felt like kind of my work circumstances were just not fair to have a dog. But now I'm working from home.
Okay.
I describe myself as an extroverted introvert. I work in marketing. I present all the time. I'm like interacting with people. But I need my alone time and I need to not talk to people and kind of shut away from the world a little bit.
You got a size in mind?
Like little to the smaller side of medium, I guess.
Okay.
Because I also live in a one-bed flat. I live on my own, have done for a long time now. I've been single for kind of 7 years. Was married, didn't end very well. I'd invested a lot of time and I thought that was going to be my life forever. But ultimately I wasn't happy, like when the divorce went through. Had a glass of champagne, like, see ya. Happily single, never met a dog.
We need to find something small from her.
I pee in a... Hi! Yay!
Okay. I think we found one. One of the things...
Friends of her friend for my sister. That sense that I am. Time in it. Winnie. What's this? Oh, look, I've got a treat for you. Dogs don't judge you for who you are. They don't judge you for decisions you make or anything like that. Oh, Snippy. I very much see, like, my dog being my best friend. Yeah, look. What's this? Winnie. What's this? No? Not digging it. Oh, dear.
I think Lauren's doing the right thing. Just got to wait it out.
Winnie. Sit. Good. Okay.
Phyllis. Come on, sit. Phyllis, sit.
Yeah, you do St. Bernard. Yeah.
Boom. Some dogs will just love anybody that shows them a bit of affection. Others are a little bit more reserved, hold themselves back. The trust needs to be built, and then boom, you're in.
Ooh. Ooh, good girl. Hello. Well, my sister's got her family, my dad's got his family, my brother's got his family. It's about time I had mine. Oh. I think...
How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm still too.
Mind where we just stop.
Never actually took to races properly. Oh, bless her. I think Opal might be too big for them.
What else?
Sorry.
And he's really come out of it. He literally just...
I'm not really excited.
What's it?
This.
Oh, he looks a bit worried. He does look really worried, doesn't he? He is.
How could anybody ever be mean to you, boy? Smells good, doesn't it, boy?
Oh, I've got a treat. Great. Yes, great.
You're like, look at that, there's really care.
absolute no-brainer. We would have just had Kurt. And I think if I'd have met only Puppy too, we'd have probably had her too.
Yeah. Is that spicy? We actually phoned one of our friends who's had a cockapoo to talk about the training.
It could take 3 to 4 years before the chewing and the mouthing has stopped. It was a really, really tricky decision. Rivers! Come on, there we go. So, this is Rufus Theodore. Yes, I like a dog's having a middle name.
Having a puppy and 2 young children is a lot of work. They love him so much that they want all of his attention all of the time.
We say to Esme, leave him alone. He then sees her playing and wants to join in. I think adopting a dog will help them with their own stories. It's very, very similar, and they had a life before. We've completed the family.
Winnie was not what I expected. Like, I roughly knew what a Lhasa Apso looked like, and I knew she was going to be white, which I was like, oh, not unexpected for me, you know, the Queen of Darkness. Winnie! Oh, hello. Winnie is like a totally different dog from when I first met her. She's the sassiest little monkey I've ever met in my entire life. And she's the biggest cuddle buddy ever. I don't think I fully understood just how much I would fall in love with her. Come on, Winnie. Come on. It's been really life-changing having a constant friend around who I think genuinely loves me, which is very cute.
A lot of change has been happening throughout the last 10 years. The world has transformed because of the internet, social media, AI, and it's really starting to get crazy right now. What is happening is that we, in our human evolution, see that there's an abundance of information, so information age. It's an abundance of things to watch, content to consume, content to create now with AI. And when we get this overabundance of AI, the real value that is going to be in demand later on is obviously what is real. You want to feel and experience something real. Why do we have this inner need to experience something real? Because we're looking always in this evolution of consciousness, we're always looking for some realness or reality or truth. Why is this? Because we came here with a certain purpose, and this purpose is not taught in schools. Your parents didn't say anything about this to you, most likely. It's something you discover on your own, because it's a personal, individual journey, and we are all individuals in consciousness, but we are alone. So it's our individual journey. That's why no one else can do things for you, and it's not satisfying when things get done for you. You have to go the journey yourself. That's how you, as a consciousness, ascend to the next realm, and that's how you, as a consciousness, starts and begin to create universes of your own. In order to do that, create a universe of your own, is the first thing you have to do is control yourself. So control the what we call ego or lower self. This is your instinctual drive. This is your emotion. This is your survival mode. Okay? And the way you control that is to actually subdue it. And you subdue it by knowing thyself. So you know that this reality is safe for you because it's your reality. It's holographic in nature, so nothing can be taken from it, nothing can be added to it, and you're already whole and complete and nothing is missing. So the whole joke in this reality is that you are separate, and we need to take from this reality. Life eats life. We need to consume other life forms, not realizing that we are not our body only. We are not our body. We are not our meat suit only. Okay, we are an expanded awareness that's experiencing the avatar, the meat suit. So I grab my board and let's draw something, because I always improvise this, because something coming through is more pure than something taught up front. It's always the case, okay? So, you are an I am. When you say I, okay, what do you identify with? If you meet someone, you say, what is your name? You say, I am. What are you pointing to? You are pointing to the heart, right? Why the heart? Why don't you say, I am here, I am? Because the heart is a central node point in your ascension. The heart is where you ascend to. So that means, okay, let's talk about something that is very, very close to my heart and important. Do you know Robert Monroe? He wrote a few books, Journeys Out of the Body, and a few other books. And he discovered, while astral projecting, that we are in a human form, a loosh form, where our energy is being siphoned. So you have low quality loosh, that is the loosh you get from hate, grief, fear, anger, all the lower emotions on the scale of consciousness. But you also have the high quality loosh, which is expressions of unconditional love. And this is the highest and most delicious form of loosh you can harvest. So all our energy is being harvested. After discovering this, Robert Monroe became depressed, and he just thought we are in a prison planet, essentially. We are prisoners, and that can make anyone depressed. So you have the Gnostic approach. The Gnosticism is embedded in a lot of schools of thoughts, ideologies, and what he discovered later, he went out of body again, and his guides came to him because he misinterpreted the human loosh farm as something negative. And they actually told him that this loosh farm is not something negative. This loosh farm is something that is siphoned back to who? So who is it siphoned back to? The energy, the information is siphoned back to the creator. The creator, so the I am. Because who is always there? Who is always watching when you experience the human life? It's the same observer when you were 10, when you were 20, when you were 30. It's the same observer over and over and over again. You are harvesting loosh in your own reality to the creator, the true self. And everything is the true self, that creator. So you're harvesting your own loosh by creating these stories, by gathering information. You can see the creator as some form of supercomputer that just conducts simulations and gathers data, information to infinity. So if you look at that, eternal, the creator, consciousness, is just simulating stories and games in order to get more information, and it synthesizes that information, wraps it up, and explodes into a new universe. So it's infinite creativity. Is the loosh then bad or negative? From a lower perspective, from the human self perspective, feeling emotions is sometimes difficult, or it's sometimes very intense, but it doesn't mean you are being siphoned from, because would you want to be here feeling nothing and just being neutral all the time? The thing is, the point in the human experience is to feel the full spectrum of emotions and the full spectrum of energies. And because you are all that is and connected to that infinite creator, which is eternal, and you are essentially immortal, it is no big deal that you feel things and you go to life stories, because you're infinite anyway. And an infinite creator wants to see the good and the bad. It wants to know itself. So it keeps simulating experiences, simulations within simulations, and then you create a whole storyline with secret governments, secret agencies, A versus B, and all these stories make life happen. Okay, and these stories can be tragic, these stories can be beautiful, but in the end, there's beauty in tragedy. In the end, there's beauty in the contrast of it, because in the deepest tragedy, that's where you can activate the most deep, unconditional love, and that's how you ascend out of the next level of consciousness. So when you have experience here, when you have activated so much unconditional love here, by knowing who you truly are, that's what makes it possible. Then you graduate and you go to the next level. Okay, to the next layer of whatever game will be simulated then. It will probably be a higher level where you are less dense and you have a non-physical body who doesn't need to do here. So you're constantly climbing up, and it's all an energy game. Everything is energy. There's nothing truly physical. The physical is just a means to play the game, to play out the stories. Life is one big story and it's beautiful, and tragedy and conflict is part of that. The contrast makes us gather more information. The contrast is the point. So this is the premise of every superhero movie. You see something bad happening in the world, and you want to fix it, and you want to create a better world. You want to be the hero, and you have the hero's journey. The thing is, when you become the hero, you start to realize that whenever you fix a problem, so you eliminate a villain, 2 more villains pop up, and then you eliminate those, and then more villains pop up. It's a never-ending game, and the superheroes come to a point where they think, what's the point if they pop up anyway? Well, the nature of this level of creation, which is not everything, so it's a very limited bandwidth, is that it is a world of contrast in density. So you have the 3D. The beauty of the 3D is you don't have to change it. You don't have to do anything in it. You cannot change it anyway, because the nature of this reality is contrast. You have death, life, rebirth, and it happens over again. You have evil people, you have good people, you have horrible things happening in nature as well, and you have good things happening. It's a complete duality. Who are you as a separate egoic identity to say, oh, I have to fix this whole reality? That's the arrogance of the ego, thinking it knows better. But reality knows better, because reality is as it is, and it does not make mistakes. Reality is absolutely perfect. So how come we see so much evil or imperfection in this world? That's because we're looking from the egoic standpoint. We're looking from a standpoint of, I am a separate being, I need to protect myself, and I need to protect my separate loved ones, and everyone is powerless. But the true paradigm, which is an elevated level of consciousness, is that everything in existence itself is unconditional love in itself, and it cannot be altered, added to, or taken from. It's already whole and complete, and that's the complete mindfuck, because there's so much contrast. There's so much bad things and good things happening, but it's always in a perfect balance, a perfect dance, and it will never stop, it will never end. You can do nothing about it, because it defeats the purpose of this layer of reality. You see, you are already perfection. You are already heaven. You are already whole and complete and angelic in your beingness. So that means what you see out here projected on the screen is just a story, it's just a game. A game of looking at someone and something that you are not. A game that is flawed, imperfect, everything is flawed. You, as your personality construct, are flawed. You make mistakes, everyone makes mistakes, everyone has issues. Everyone has issues, yeah. And That's the point. The point is the issue. The point is, how are you faring in your consciousness? How strong are you in unconditional love with a story that has so many flaws and issues? Are you completely identified with the third dimensional world or the physical world? Or are you able to go higher in dimensions and know thyself as the truth of who you truly are? So this contrast is challenging, and it's meant to be that way. So when you see, for example, you see things going wrong, you see challenges every single day, you see trends, things changing, you have to adapt. You see harm being done, you see beautiful things being done, and it's imbalanced. So that means, okay, from a human perspective, when you look at someone else, and you start comparing yourself to someone else, it means you all get your amount of suffering. Everyone gets their right amount of suffering because you cannot escape duality. Have you noticed that when something very good happens, something else happens to balance it out? When you, for example, when you drink a lot and then you have the hangover next day, the duality will always cancel itself out. Okay? And the alchemists, the hermetics, knew this. They knew of the principle of duality and rhythm and the principle of polarity, which is the same as duality. And they learned how to hack this up and down cycle. They learned how to hack it with being something beyond it, with knowing that they are the mind behind everything. So you get to stay in a positive state, even in the downside of the roller coaster ride we call life. And then you're out of the bondage. You are out of the cycle, which says as well, you will graduate out of the reincarnation cycle of Earth. The Earth is an energy game. So if you're lost in life or your business or your cumulative wealth and you feel empty still, that is because the things in here are not the point. If you are lost in ideologies or spiritual practices and you got lost in the techniques instead of the essence, the tricks and the techniques are not the point. What is the point? This is the point. Upgrading your energy that high that you can embody more divinity, more unconditional love in the face of difficulty. Because that is when it counts. You cannot, for example, show courage when you have no fear. They come together. You can only be courageous when you are very, very scared. And that takes devotion and a sense of surrender as well. The reason you're empty inside, and this is the human condition, we all feel empty at a certain point in our life, because that's the point. You feel disconnected from the that's when you are cut off from the source of who you are. The source of who you are is, like I said, knowing thyself, that you are literally everything and you project everything outside of you. Even your stories, even the victims and abusers' stories that happen all the time, which are all valid, and you have to play along. You have to play the game. You cannot just not stand up for yourself when something happens. You have to honor the human game, and you can't do otherwise, because it's just who you are. As a human, you are self-contained, you are protective of your boundaries, you take care of your body, and the separation is everywhere. But simultaneously, you hold in your perception, because that's the highest consciousness you can embody, the human self, the higher self, and the source of everything. The source of everything. Opening this up means you surrender to truth, which means you get special access to some abilities that you may need. Depends on if you need it in your journey. You get access to inner knowing, inner peace. You get access to everything because you have stopped separating yourself from your own world. And when you get access to everything, you get to mold everything. And it even comes to this point when, okay, when you are in a creative mode, creator mode, you run out of things that you want to create because you notice it's not the point, and then you are not even interested anymore in creating things because you're just letting life happen. And that sounds very passive, I know. There's always a balance that those two are always dancing around each other. So the beingness and the doing are always changing and moving around. So it's not only be or only do, it's a synergy of the two that happens. And that's just my observation. I hope that makes sense because I'm talking about something that many of you that I talk to also have questions about. So you, at some point in your journey, you feel, in the beginning, most likely you feel disempowered. We are born as helpless babies. That creates a complex from the get-go, a complex that you are weak and vulnerable and separate, and you need to fawn to your parents. You need to fawn to them, serve them as servants because they are essentially your gods and your masters. And it's the truth. We think kids love their parents. No, they're just fawning to them because they are dependent on them. The true love comes out when they become independent. If they still return to the parents, that's love. If they don't, it was just a survival mechanism and they couldn't wait to get away from you. So that's not unconditional love. The child doesn't get unconditional love because it cannot. It is in a state of disempowerment and it's simply fawning to you. And if the parent knows that and respects the new soul as a complete magical individual human being, a co-creator with them, then they feel respected as a soul, and then it's like, okay, now we are on an equal power dynamic, so now we can choose to express love to one another and not be in this codependent situation. So what happens as well is when you are finally independent in society, you get to go away from the people that you thought you needed. You get to finally have a sense of self and think for yourself, because now you don't need to fawn to anyone. You get to choose who you are around, and you get to be independent. What happens is then you start to think about the meaning. So you've been imprisoned in the beginning stages of vulnerability, disempowerment. The reason why adults are struggling when they grow up is because finally they got out, but that complex is still running, that program is still running, that they are disempowered or vulnerable, they have this hyper dependence on the system, and the parents are often replaced by a new mommy and daddy, which is, the new mommy is the government, the new daddy is the police force. So this complex is what runs society. And it is like a cosmic joke that we are born helpless as babies, completely vulnerable, and that's exactly for that reason that consciousness loses itself completely. The difference is the complete opposite of consciousness itself, and yet is one of the purest things you can create. So you are still consciousness in baby form, which is infinite, internal, all-powerful, eternal. But then you grow up with a complex that you are never good enough and you're never strong enough because you've been conditioned and programmed to look up at those big people that know better what to do. And when you grow up and become bigger yourself, you can have a choice. You choose to stop feeding that program and break the loop and start to realize, oh wait, it was all an illusion that I was helpless, because I am actually the formless spirit looking through my eyes. Or you can choose to stay in your identity and feel small, like a victim your whole life against a big bad world. So that's the choice. And neither is good or bad, it's just a new experience, because consciousness does not judge. No judgment, only ego judges the world. And with great empathy, because we know how it feels to feel powerless, we can also look upon others, and our compassion actually deepens because we know, okay, they're still stuck in that disempowerment. They have a disempowerment pain there, and that's because they don't know who they are as a source. They don't know how powerful they truly are. And it's not even about powerful, because powerfulness implies that there's powerlessness. It is that the whole duality actually collapses, and there's no such thing as powerfulness or powerlessness. There is no such thing. It's just you are it. You are everything. And that is way more radical than just knowing that you are powerful. But as a human, you can do quite a few things. You can be powerful.
What happened when villagers found a trapped alpha wolf and called a wildlife expert? They brought in a wildlife rescuer to free him. Everyone expected the wolf to run straight into the forest the moment he was released. But that's not what happened. Instead, the wolf followed the rescuer home, as if he had decided to stay. At first, he was cautious and nervous. Thinking he was hungry, the man left out some food and assumed that would be the end of it. The next morning, he opened his door and froze. The wolf was back, and this time he wasn't alone. Several members of his pack stood near.
Of all the skeletons the Smithsonian's Mound Survey lifted out of American ground, and across 8 years and every state east of the Mississippi they lifted thousands, their own report names the largest. It came out of a mound 70 feet across on the bluffs above the Mississippi at Dunleith, Illinois, encased in earth so hard it held every bone in place. The agents measured it where it lay, because that is what they were trained to do. The report gives the result as proved by actual measurement, between 7 and 8 feet. And then they lifted it out of the ground, and inside of a minute there was nothing left to measure. It crumbled to pieces in their hands. The largest skeleton the Bureau of Ethnology ever recorded survived its burial by about 60 seconds. Tonight we read the Dunleith file, all of it, including the government table with a giant printed in the notes column, and then 2 more files from the same report that this channel has never opened. If you have been with this channel for the last few files, you know the source, but it bears 1 paragraph, because everything tonight stands on it. Between 1882 and 1890, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology ran the largest archaeological survey in American history. Trained agents in the field, with tapes and notebooks, publishing through the government printing office. Their results fill the Bureau's 12th annual report, more than 700 pages, and every word we read you tonight is printed in it. Dunleith sits on the Illinois bank of the Mississippi, directly opposite Dubuque, Iowa. Today the town is called East Dubuque. In the 1880s, the bluffs above it carried a group of mounds looking down on the river. Bureau's men were not the first to put a spade in this hillside. The report records that mound number 4 had been partially explored back in 1857, a generation earlier, and that dig had turned up masses of burned earth and charred human bones, mingled with charcoal and ashes. So the group above Dunleith had been giving up strange burials for 30 years before the Federal Survey ever arrived to write them down properly. Hold on to mound 4. We are coming back to it. And before they wrote a single paragraph about it, they put the group in a table, mound by mound, number, diameter in feet, height in feet, and a notes column. It is the driest document imaginable, a government survey table, and it is worth putting on screen, because the row for mound number 5 reads like this: 5, 70, 12, 5 words: large skeleton, copper ornaments, etc. etc. A skeleton that their own report calls one of the largest ever found by the survey, compressed by some clerk into a table note with an etc. on the end. Whatever else you take from tonight, remember that this file begins in a column of figures, in the most boring document the American government knew how to produce. And run your eye down the rest of that notes column, because the flavor of the whole group is in it. One mound contained a stone crypt. Another, and this may be the most honest line in the whole 700 pages, opened, but result unknown. Somebody dug into it at some point, and whatever they found or took, no record survives of it at all. That is the country these mounds have stood in for a century and a half. Dug at, emptied, unrecorded. The Bureau's table is often the only reason we know anything was ever there. Mound 5 was the largest of the group, and the report says it was carefully examined. 70 feet in diameter, 12 feet high. The agents opened it from the top, the way they always did. 2 feet down, near the apex, they struck a skeleton and passed over it in a sentence. Doubtless, says the report, an intrusive Indian burial. Somebody buried long after the mound was raised, in its convenient soft summit. The survey had seen hundreds of these. It is not the story. Near the original ground surface, several feet north of the center, they found something heavier, the much decayed skeletons of some 6 or 8 persons, and then the report adds a phrase that does quiet work, of every size, from the infant to the adult. 6 or 8 people, laid out horizontally at full length, heads to the south, all together, babies and grown adults in one burial. With them, a few perforated shells and some rough stone skinners and scrapers. Whatever put that group in the ground at the same time, the report does not guess at it, and neither will we. But hold the picture. A family, or something like one, laid in a row under the floor of the mound. And then, near the original surface, 10 or 12 feet out from the center on the lower side, lying at full length upon its back, was the reason this file exists. I will read the sentence exactly as the Bureau printed it. Was one of the largest skeletons discovered by the Bureau agents, the length as proved by actual measurement being between 7 and 8 feet. Proved by actual measurement, 4 words, and they are doing more work than any sentence this channel has read you all season. Not estimated, not judged by an eye, not reconstructed later from a drawing. An agent of the Federal Survey knelt over that skeleton with a tape, while it lay complete in the ground, measured it end to end, and the number was entered as proof. And notice the report gives a window between 7 and 8 feet, rather than a single figure. That is not sloppiness. That is what an honest field measurement of a skeleton in earth looks like. Where exactly the crown of the skull ends, where the heel bones finish, how the joints have settled over centuries. A man inventing a giant writes 8 feet and moves on. A man measuring 1 writes what his tape can defend. And understand what that hard earth was doing, because it explains everything that happened next. Bone that has lain in the ground for centuries is not the solid thing you imagine. The organic part rots out of it early, and what remains is a mineral shell, often soft as chalk, held in shape by the soil packed around it. The earth is the mold, and the bone is barely more than the shape inside the mold. Dig away the support, lift the shape into dry air, and it can simply let go. The survey's men knew this, which is exactly why they measured first and lifted second. Here is the rest of the passage. It was all clearly traceable, but crumbled to pieces immediately after removal from the hard earth in which it was encased. The earth held it. For however many centuries that mound stood over it, the packed hard fill was the only thing keeping those bones in the shape of a man. The agents measured it where it lay, complete, clearly traceable from skull to heel, and the moment they lifted it free of the earth that had cradled it, it went to pieces in their hands. Now think about what that does to this file, because it is different from every vanishing this channel has read you. The Tennessee Giant went to a professor, the Castle Now Bones went to Paris, the Kanawha Giant went into the National Collection. In every one of those files there is an address, and a door you could in principle knock on. Dunleith has no address. The largest skeleton the survey ever measured was destroyed by the act of collecting it, in front of the only people who ever saw it whole. which means the measurement is all there is. No specimen for a later expert to shrink, no drawer for it to be lost from, no bones for anyone to re-examine, doubt, or quietly reclassify. Just a federal agent's tape, a printed proof, and dust. If you wanted to argue with Dunleith, there has been nothing to argue with since about 1 minute after it came out of the ground. The record is the entire remains. But the man in that grave left more than a measurement, because what was buried with him survived just fine. Copper does not crumble. 3 thin crescent-shaped pieces of roughly hammered native copper, 6, 8, and 10 inches long, each punched with small holes along the curved edge, a number of elongate copper beads, made by rolling thin sheets, and a chert lance head over 11 inches long, 11 inches of worked stone blade, lying with him. Around his neck, a series of bare teeth, a necklace, and the report adds there were also several upon the wrists, bare teeth at the throat and bare teeth at both wrists. And lying across the thighs, dozens of small copper beads, which the report suggests once adorned the fringe of a hunting shirt, each bead formed by rolling a slender wire-like strip of copper into a ring. Read that detail again. He went into the ground dressed. A fringed shirt sewn with copper, crescents of copper at his body, a blade nearly a foot long, and the teeth of bears at his neck and wrists. The survey measured a man between 7 and 8 feet, buried like a chief, above a row of 6 or 8 dead of every age. This channel said it about the vault at Kanawha, and it is true again here. That is a burial somebody spent wealth on. Hammered copper was currency in that world. It travelled hundreds of miles from the Lake Superior country, and somebody sewed it onto the clothes of a dead man and closed 70 feet of mound over him. Now, we told you to hold on to mound number 4, the one first opened in 1857. The Bureau went back into it properly, and on the lower side they found the end of a double line of flat stones set on edge, a foot apart at the bottom and leaning together to meet at the top, a roof-shaped arch running inward on the level, nearly to the centre of the mound, a built passage of stone under the hill. It led to a vault, a grave, dug down into the original ground before the mound was ever raised over it, and in that grave the agents found a burial unlike anything else this channel has read you from this report. Over the portion of the skeleton below the waist, flat stones had been placed, leaning against one another so as to support each other and keep any pressure off the body. Careful work, protective work, no trace of fire anywhere on them. The right arm had been taken out of its socket and laid beside the body, below the waist, under that same protecting cover of stone. And then the report reaches the upper half of the man, and I will read it exactly. Although extended in a natural position, they were but charred remains, scarcely traceable amid the charcoal and ashes of a fire that had nearly consumed them. The Bureau's own reconstruction of the sequence is printed on the page. A grave was dug first. The right arm was dislocated and placed beside the body, and the lower half was covered and protected with stone. Then the remainder, the living position upper half of the man, was burned to a cinder where it lay, and over all of it a mound was raised, sealing in, alongside him, a further pile of charred human bones, charcoal and ash. Half of him shielded from the weight of the world by stones placed one against another with evident care, the other half of him given to fire. Nobody alive knows what that meant to the people who did it. The report does not guess, and this channel will not either. But that is the hillside the big man of Mound 5 was buried on, and these were his neighbours in the earth. Whatever was happening above Dunleith, it was not ordinary, and the government wrote all of it down. One more thing about the record, and it is a detail for the people who like to check us, which we encourage. The Bureau printed this find twice. In the big 12th annual report you get the full account we have just read. In the Bureau's companion volume on the burial mounds of the northern sections, the same find appears compressed into one line. An unusually large skeleton, the length being something over 7 feet. Same mound, same find. 2 official printings. When this channel read you that shorter line in the Kanawha file, that was this man. Tonight you have the rest of him. Now, 2 files from the same report that we have never opened. The first takes us back to the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, to a mound the survey found standing entirely alone, no enclosure, No companion mounds, nothing near it, which the report itself calls a peculiar circumstance. Even after years of ploughing, it stood 20 feet high and fully 300 feet around. The old war trail, the report notes, crossed the spur just below it. The agents sank a circular shaft 11 feet across from the summit to bedrock. At the top, they found a heap of rock filling a depression, and the report records, in passing, that the heap had already been disturbed by parties, it says, who found a very large skeleton with some stone weapons. Parties unnamed, a very large skeleton, already gone before the survey arrived, into hands the record does not identify. That is the entire trace it leaves. One subordinate clause in a government report, and this channel simply hands it to you as printed. What the agents themselves found is stranger. Below the rock, sandstone slabs as heavy as a man could lift, scattered down the shaft, and at the bottom enough of them standing and lying at angles to have once covered a vault. The vault had been nearly square, about 12 feet on a side, and it was not set square to the world. The report says it was placed diagonally to the cardinal points. And the mound itself was not made of earth. Excepting the outer skin and a few feet at the bottom, the entire body of that 20-foot mound was composed of ashes, mostly pure ashes, the report says, all very light and easily shoveled. Somebody laid a clay level, put down a floor of bark, spread clean ashes across it, built a 12-foot timber vault turned to the diagonal, and then raised a hill of ash over the whole thing. The survey wrote it all down and offered no explanation. Neither will we. The second file is shorter, and it is the quietest image in tonight's episode. On a sandy ridge north of the Sheboygan Marshes in Wisconsin, 100 feet above the wetland, the agents opened a conical mound 50 feet across. At the bottom, near the center, in the report's words, a large human skeleton in a sitting posture was discovered, apparently holding between its hands and knees a large clay vessel. Sitting upright at the bottom of his mound, holding a pot between his hands and his knees, under an irregular layer of flat boulders. The vessel was in fragments. The report records nothing else worthy of notice, and does not say what the vessel held, because by the time anyone asked the question, there was no answer left in the ground. So add tonight to the ledger, a large skeleton in a government table with an etc. after it, the survey's own largest, proved by actual measurement between 7 and 8 feet, destroyed by daylight 60 seconds after proof. A very large skeleton in West Virginia, carried off by parties unnamed before the government even arrived. A large man seated in the dark under Wisconsin, holding a vessel nobody can ever look inside. Every one of those sentences is the Smithsonian's from one report, printed in 1894, public record, free to download. The survey was not looking for giants, and this channel has told you before why that makes its tapes worth more, not less. The agents simply wrote down what their tapes told them, and their tapes kept saying the same thing, in Illinois, in West Virginia, in Wisconsin, in Tennessee, in Ohio. The largest one they ever measured existed, whole and clearly traceable, for exactly as long as it took to prove the number. Then the air took it. There is no vault to open on this one, no institution to write to, no drawer in any basement. There is a line in a table, a paragraph on a page, and a proof, which is either the most frustrating file in this drawer or the purest one. Nobody can produce these bones, and nobody can ever make them disappear either, because they already have, in front of federal witnesses, with the number safely in print. The measurement outlived the man, the mound, and the skeleton itself. It is all that is left, and it says between 7 and 8 feet. Read the file, draw your own conclusions.
At the beginning of the 5th century, Rome's rule over Britain was linked to a lumbering.
was buried in that cave. Fall 1911, southern Nevada. Two miners named David Pugh and James Hart are 3 to 6 feet down into the floor of a cave 20 miles south of Lovelock, shoveling bat guano into crates for a fertilizer company in San Francisco. They have been doing this for months. The cave is dark, low-ceilinged, thick with the smell of 1,000 years of occupation. They are not archaeologists. They are not looking for anything except guano. Then Hart's shovel hits something different. In the north-central section of the cave, 4 feet deep, he finds a body. Not bones, a body. Mummified. Preserved by the same dry cave conditions that had kept everything else in here intact for centuries. Hart writes about it later in a report that still exists. The body was, he says, a striking-looking man. 6 feet 6 inches tall, hair distinctly red. He called him a giant. That description, red hair, extraordinary height, preserved in a Nevada cave, had already been written down 28 years earlier. Not by an archaeologist, not by a miner, by a Paiute woman named Sarah Winnemucca, daughter of Chief Winnemucca of the Northern Paiute, writing the first autobiography ever published by a Native American woman. She had described these people from memory, from oral tradition, from a mourning dress trimmed with their hair that had been passed through her family for generations. She wrote it in 1883. The miners found the body in 1911. The question isn't whether something was buried in that cave. The question is how a woman writing a book in Boston knew exactly what the miners would find. Sarah Winnemucca's book is called Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims. It's not a book about giants. It's an autobiography about her people suffering under American settlement, written to raise money for her lecture tour and documented their history for the first time in their own words. The Sita appear in it almost incidentally, as part of a larger history of war and survival. She writes that her people fought a prolonged war against a tribe called the Sita. The name translates in northern Paiute as tool eaters, after the fibrous water plant they used to build rafts for crossing what was then a vast inland lake covering most of northern Nevada. She describes them as fierce, cannibalistic, physically unlike the Paiute. After years of warfare, all the tribes in the region united against them, which is significant because those tribes were normally enemies of each other. The Sita were the only thing that made them cooperate. The final battle happened at a cave. The Sita retreated inside. The tribes piled brush at the entrance and set it alight. Those who tried to escape were killed. Those who stayed died from the smoke. And then she writes something that reads differently once you know what the miners found in 1911. She writes, "My people say that the tribe we exterminated had reddish hair. I have some of their hair, which has been handed down from father to son. I have a dress which has been in our family a great many years, trimmed with the reddish hair. I'm going to wear it sometime when I lecture. It is called a mourning dress, and no one has such a dress but my family. A mourning dress trimmed with the hair of the people they killed, passed down through generations as a family heirloom. The reddish hair wasn't a detail she added for effect. It was physical. Her family owned it. It was sitting in a trunk somewhere in Nevada while she wrote that sentence in a Boston lecture hall. 28 years later, 4 feet beneath the floor of a cave 20 miles south of Lovelock, James Hart pulls a mummified body from the guano and writes, hair distinctly red. The cave had a soot-blackened ceiling. When archaeologists from the University of California arrived the following year and began the first systematic excavation of the site, they found burnt arrow shafts embedded in the walls near the entrance, physical evidence of a fire, physical evidence of arrows, exactly where the Paiute oral tradition said the final battle had happened. The story Winnemucca's family had been telling for generations was confirmed not by a document or a theory, but by charred wood still embedded in rock. By the time the University of California got there in 1912, most of what had been in the upper layers of the cave was already gone. The guano mining operation had removed 250 tons of material from the cave floor, 3 to 6 feet deep across the entire site, before anyone notified a single institution. Whatever was in those layers was screened out, mixed with guano, and shipped to a fertilizer company in San Francisco. The archaeologist sent to salvage what remained was a man named Llewellyn Loud. He spent 5 months excavating Lovelock Cave in 1912, returned with a colleague named Mark Harrington in 1924, and together they published a detailed report in 1929 through the University of California Press. 10,000 artifacts recovered, 40 storage pits documented, a comprehensive catalogue of everything that survived the guano miners. The 1929 report confirms what Hart had written, not in one place, throughout. Much of the hair found on the mummies in the cave, Loud and Harrington write, is reddish. That's the University of California's official published report, not a newspaper account, not an alternative history website, the peer-reviewed academic publication that became the foundational reference for Great Basin archaeology. The same report also documents what had been lost before they arrived. The guano crew had taken bones, especially skulls. Some mummies had been taken by members of the mining operation. And then this. The best specimen of the adult mummies was boiled and destroyed by a local fraternal lodge, which wanted the skeleton for initiation purposes. The best specimen of the adult mummies, boiled for a ritual initiation. Whatever James Hart had described, 6 feet 6 inches, hair distinctly red, the best of what the cave contained was gone before any scientist saw it. Reduced to a skeleton for a lodge ceremony and then discarded, what Loud did recover gives you a sense of what the cave held. 15-inch sandals, not modern, ancient, woven from rush fiber preserved by the dry cave environment, documented in the excavation and later displayed at the Nevada Historical Society in Reno. A foot that required a 15-inch sandal is the foot of someone significantly larger than the people the Paiute described as their own ancestors. Those sandals are a physical fact. They have been held, examined, photographed. A stone disc with 365 notches carved around the outside and 52 corresponding notches on the inner ring. Researchers have suggested this functions as a calendar. The number of days in a year divided into the number of weeks, carved into stone by people the official history describes as hunter-gatherers with no astronomical knowledge. And the duck decoys, 11 of them found buried in a hidden cache in 1924, wrapped in rush matting, feathered, painted to represent canvas-back ducks with a precision that researchers described as extraordinary. Radiocarbon dating in the 1980s placed them at 2,000 to 2,250 years old. The oldest known waterfowl decoys in the world, they now sit in the Smithsonian. The people who made them understood duck behavior, painting techniques, and preservation methods well enough that their decoys survived intact for over 2 millennia. None of this fits the standard description of the cave's inhabitants as simple hunter-gatherers. The calendar stone alone represents astronomical observation and mathematical organization. The decoys represent sophisticated craft knowledge. The sandals represent feet that didn't belong to the same population as the other mummies in the cave. John T. Reed had been living in Lovelock since before the turn of the century. Mining engineer, amateur anthropologist, fluent in Paiute, he had heard the Sitekar legend directly from Paiute elders in 1886 when they took him to see the cave. He spent years trying to get a proper excavation funded, writing to the University of Pennsylvania, writing to the Smithsonian. Nobody came. After the guano miners opened the site and Loud's excavations were complete, Reed began documenting the discoveries appearing in the lake bed around Lovelock. The Nevada Review Miner, February 1931, reports that a skeleton had been found in the dry bed of Humboldt Lake near the cave. Reed personally excavated it. He measured it in place before moving anything. His measurement, 7 feet 7 inches. The same newspaper in June 1931 reports another discovery nearby. One skeleton measuring 8.5 feet, described as wrapped in a gum-covered fabric similar to Egyptian mummies. A second skeleton described as nearly 10 feet long, both with red hair. These are local Nevada newspapers covering local Nevada discoveries, not alternative history, not internet speculation. The Lovelock Review Miner, the Nevada Review Miner, the Nevada State Journal. County papers reporting on things their readers could go and see. The Nevada State Journal published a piece on April 17, 1932, covering Reed's work. It quotes from his documentation. One of his great finds, the paper writes, was a skeleton found about 20 miles southerly of Lovelock, showing that the body was exactly 7 feet 7 inches tall. It is one of the giant men of an ancient race of which skeletons were unearthed in central Nevada. An ancient race, that's what the local newspaper called it in 1932. Not a medical anomaly, not measurement error, an ancient race documented by a mining engineer who could speak Paiute and had been investigating the region for 40 years. Reed's papers, his personal correspondence, his field notes, his newspaper articles, are held at the Nevada Historical Society in Reno. They are accessible. They are not hidden. The documentation exists. What doesn't exist is any institutional follow-up. No university sent a team, no museum organized an expedition. The skeletons were noted, measured, and then absorbed into the silence that followed every giant discovery in this period. The Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada, held skulls from the Lovelock region for decades, not on public display, in a storage cabinet in the basement shown to visitors on request. Don Monroe photographed them in the 1970s. His photographs show a collection of large skulls, including one with a reddish cast. A researcher named M.K. Davis visited in 2006 and photographed the same collection. His photographs show the same reddish skull visible in Monroe's images from 30 years earlier. Between the two visits, however, something had changed. An extraordinary mandible visible in Monroe's photographs, a jaw with what appeared to be filed teeth, was gone. Not moved to another shelf, gone. Davis documented his conversation with the museum's elderly curator. She showed him 4 large skulls in a basement cabinet and told him why they weren't on public display. Nevada State, she said, does not recognize their legitimacy. The museum was prohibited from displaying them. The state had not classified these skulls as something worth preserving. It had classified them as something to be doubted. Barbara Powell, director of the museum collection, confirmed this to researchers. The museum could not display the skulls because the state did not recognize their legitimacy, not because they had been proven to be fakes, not because testing had shown they were ordinary human remains, because the state had decided not to recognize them. By 2013, BLM officials had arrived at the museum. They told the curator the skulls could no longer be shown to anyone. They were filing paperwork to confiscate them under federal protection, given that they had been found on BLM land. Within months, the skulls were gone, repatriated to the Lovelock colony, reburied according to the official record at an undisclosed location. An undisclosed location where they can never be independently examined. The pattern that runs through every giant discovery in this country ends the same way. The evidence is documented, sometimes photographed, sometimes held in institutional collections for decades, and then always it becomes inaccessible. Not destroyed, not disproven, just moved somewhere that no independent researcher can reach it, reclassified under a legal framework that prioritizes reburial over examination, placed in the dark where the questions it raises can be quietly forgotten. The cave is still there, 20 miles south of Lovelock on a dirt road through the Humboldt Sink. You can walk to it. You can stand at the entrance where the Paiute piled the brush and set the fire. You can see the soot on the ceiling that Loud and Harrington documented in 1929. The environment that preserved duck decoys for 2,000 years, that mummified a red-haired body so completely that a miner could describe the hair colour in a written report, that kept rush fibre sandals intact for 20 centuries. That environment is unchanged. Whatever the cave held before two miners with shovels and a fertilizer contract removed 250 tons of material from its floor, whatever was in the layers the guano operation destroyed before anyone thought to call a scientist, that is lost. But the cave itself remains. The charred walls remain. The burnt arrow shafts that Loud found remain on record. Sarah Winnemucca knew about the red hair in 1883. She owned some of it. She wore it. She stood in Boston lecture halls and told audiences about the tribe her people had driven into a cave and burned alive. And she described their reddish hair as something her family had preserved across generations because it was important to remember what they had defeated. 28 years later, 4 feet beneath the surface of that cave, James Hart found exactly what she described. Not a legend confirmed by story. A legend confirmed by a mummy in the dark, still red-haired, still 6 feet 6, still exactly where the Paiute said it would be. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, there's more like it here. In the autumn of 1887, a thin young man from Indiana stepped off a wagon at the edge of a valley in the Great Smoky Mountains of western North Carolina, carrying a leather notebook and a small satchel of pencils, and began writing down sentences that the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington would not know how to categorize for the next 130 years. His name was James Mooney. He was 26 years old. He had no formal training in anthropology, no university degree, and no clear instructions beyond the general charge to record what the Eastern Band of Cherokee remembered about their own past before that memory was gone. What he wrote down over the next 3 years, in a series of tight cursive notebooks that are still preserved in the Smithsonian archives, is a body of testimony that no mainstream historian has ever fully explained. Because the Cherokee elders Mooney interviewed, the men and women who had been alive before the Trail of Tears and who still lived on the small reservation known as the Qualla Boundary, did not describe the mountains around them as an empty wilderness that their ancestors had settled. They described the mountains as inherited ground. They spoke of an older forest, older than the Cherokee themselves, that had belonged to a people who came before, and they described that earlier people in language so specific and so consistent across informants that Mooney eventually stopped trying to fit the descriptions into any framework he had been given. The old forest, as the Cherokee described it to Mooney, was not simply the woodland that stood on the ridges in the 1880s. It was a condition of the land that had existed before the Cherokee arrived, and it had been maintained by beings the Cherokee did not classify as fully human. 3 principal names came up in the elders' accounts of these earlier inhabitants. The Nunnehi, which Mooney rendered as the immortals or the people who live anywhere, were said to occupy invisible townhouses inside certain mountains and to appear as ordinary travelers to any Cherokee they chose to meet. Below them in the ordering of these beings came the Yunwi-Tsunsdi, the little people, described as small and pale, no taller than a child, who lived in rock shelters and hollow places, and who taught the first medicine men the sacred formulas. A third category the Cherokee spoke of with unusual care were a people they called the moon-eyed ones, who had lived in the region long before the Cherokee themselves, and who could not see well in daylight because their eyes were suited to a different kind of world. Mooney recorded the accounts, noted that similar traditions had been reported to the Moravian missionary Benjamin Barton nearly a century earlier, and moved on. Hiloting. He did not press the elders on what it meant that 3 separate peoples were said to have preceded the Cherokee in a mountain range that mainstream archaeology in 1887 considered to have been continuously inhabited by a single population. To understand why Mooney was in a position to hear what he heard, it is worth pausing on the man himself. Born in Richmond, Indiana, in 1861, the son of Irish immigrants, he had taught himself the rudiments of ethnology by reading in the small public library of that town while working as a printer's assistant. By the age of 19, he had memorized the names and known ranges of every North American tribe. A letter he addressed to John Wesley Powell, the founding director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, requesting employment, resulted in him being taken on as a junior assistant in 1885 on the strength of that letter alone. When the Qualla boundary assignment came 2 years later, Mooney had already spent months learning what he could of the Cherokee language from written sources and from the tiny circle of Cherokee speakers who could then be found in Washington. He arrived at the reservation in the company of a translator, but discharged him within a month, having decided that the presence of an intermediary was corrupting the material. From then on, Mooney worked alone, sitting in cabins by wood stoves, drinking whatever coffee was offered him, and listening. Elders who had at first refused to speak to him began to speak. Others sent word from remote coves that they wished to be visited. By the end of his second winter on the reservation, Mooney was being addressed by a Cherokee name of his own, and the notebooks were filling faster than he could organize them. The most careful of his informants was a man named Ayunini, whose name translates roughly as swimmer, and who was already an old man when Mooney met him. Swimmer had spent his life preserving the sacred formulas of Cherokee medicine in a personal manuscript book written in the Sequoia syllabary that he kept wrapped in cloth and hidden in the rafters of his cabin. The book contained roughly 600 formulas, some for curing illness, some for hunting, some for love, and a smaller number classified by Swimmer under a category he translated as remembering. These last were not prayers or medicine chants in the ordinary sense. They were mnemonic texts, in a compact and archaic form of Cherokee, that recited events understood to have taken place in what Swimmer called the older time. The remembering formulas were the ones Swimmer would not read aloud to Mooney in ordinary settings, and the ones Mooney was permitted to copy only under conditions of considerable trust. Their content, as best Mooney was able to determine, was a compressed oral history of the period before the Cherokee arrival in the southern Appalachians, transmitted in a form designed to preserve exact wording across many generations. When Mooney gained his trust, Swimmer began dictating the contents of that book. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And elaborating on what the formulas meant. He described a period the Cherokee remembered as the time before the animals were named, when the world was still being organized and the boundaries between the visible and the invisible had not yet been fixed. In that period, Swimmer said, the mountains were higher than they are now, the rivers ran in different courses, and the people who lived in the forest were not yet divided into the categories of human and spirit. That division came later, after what Swimmer called the Great Settling, when the ground itself was rearranged and many of the earlier inhabitants withdrew into places the Cherokee could no longer reach. Mooney recorded the account with characteristic precision and added a note in the margin of his field notebook that read simply, "Informant insists this was a physical event." The idea that a physical event had reshaped the southern Appalachians within human memory was not something the Bureau of American Ethnology was prepared to publish in 1900. When Mooney's monograph, Myths of the Cherokee, was finally released as the 19th annual report of the Bureau, the accounts of the Moon-Eyed People and the Great Settling were included but presented as folklore, alongside animal fables and creation stories, in a framing that treated them as literary artifacts rather than historical claims. What did not appear in the printed monograph, and what has only recently been examined by researchers going back to the original notebooks, is the volume of corroborating detail Mooney collected from other informants that pointed in the same direction. A woman named Ayasta described the older forest as having contained large stone enclosures that the Cherokee had found already ruined when they arrived. An elder named Suyeta spoke of mounds that were not built by his people, and of straight ridgelines that seemed to have been shaped rather than eroded. A man named Tagwadihi, whose name means Catawba Killer, told Mooney that certain valleys in the Balsam Range were considered unsafe to enter at night because the earlier inhabitants had not entirely left. Each of these accounts was recorded, filed, and largely omitted from the final publication. What the elders were describing, taken together, was a landscape that had been inhabited, modified, and then partially abandoned by a civilization older than the Cherokee, and that this civilization had not vanished completely but had instead retreated into a state the Cherokee described as adjacent to their own. The Nunahi lived in townhouses inside mountains that could sometimes be entered and more often could not. In the same rock shelters the Cherokee themselves used, the little people lived on a schedule that did not overlap with human daylight. As for the Moon-eyed people, they had gone west, or gone under, depending on which elder was telling the story, but they were not considered extinct, they were considered relocated. And the forest itself, the deep hardwood cove forest of the southern Blue Ridge, was described not as a natural formation, but as the surface expression of an older system, a garden that had been tended once and had been allowed to grow wild after its keepers withdrew. Physical evidence for what the Cherokee described was, and is, scattered across the southern Appalachians in a form that mainstream archaeology has never adequately explained. At Fort Mountain in northern Georgia, a serpentine dry stone wall running for nearly 900 feet along a ridge was attributed by the Cherokee to the Moon-eyed people, and no confirmed builder has ever been established. Further west, the Old Stone Fort in central Tennessee, a 50-acre enclosure of earth and stone walls with a single narrow entrance, has been radiocarbon dated to the early centuries of the Common Era, but has no clear cultural affiliation with any known regional population. At Judaculla Rock, in Jackson County, North Carolina, the petroglyphs, which the Cherokee attributed to a giant named Tsul'kalu who lived in the older time, contain symbols that do not match any documented indigenous writing system in the eastern woodlands. Mooney visited Judaculla Rock himself in 1888 and recorded the elder swimmer's explanation that the marks had been made when the mountains were still soft, before the world hardened into its current form. Mainstream interpretation treats that phrase as mythological. Mooney's marginal note treats it as an unresolved question. Tsul'kalu himself, the being to whom the Judaculla petroglyphs were attributed, is worth considering carefully because the Cherokee accounts of him are unusually specific. He was said to have been a slant-eyed giant, 7-fingered on each hand, who lived on a mountain called Sunagunyi, which Mooney identified with the modern Balsam Range in Jackson County. His hunting pack of dogs was so large the animals could be heard for miles when they ran a deer. In his house, whose door faced east, the stones had been fitted without mortar, and he was said to have taken a Cherokee wife once, in the older time, and to have offered her family a bride price of game meat piled higher than a townhouse roof. The story, in its full form as recorded by Swimmer, contains details that read less like folklore than like an inventory of a specific individual known to a specific community. Mooney noted in the margin that Swimmer used the past definite tense throughout, the grammatical form the Cherokee reserved for events considered to have actually occurred, rather than the past indefinite used for stories understood as instructive fiction. The distinction is a fine one in translation but sharp in the original language, and Swimmer was consistent about it. In his account, Tsul'kalu had lived. His house had stood, the pile of game meat had been assembled, and had been counted. There is a specific detail in Mooney's notebooks that has drawn increased attention in recent years. In an entry dated November of 1888, Mooney recorded that Swimmer had described the old forest as having once been open beneath, meaning that the ground between the trees had been kept clear by burning, by the removal of undergrowth, and by the deliberate maintenance of what the elder called walking rooms. Swimmer said that when the Cherokee first arrived in the mountains, they had found forest that a person could ride a horse through at speed for miles, forest with a canopy so continuous that no rain reached the ground and no undergrowth grew. Forest that was, in effect, a cultivated park stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. He described the ground beneath as covered in a soft carpet of leaf litter that had built up over centuries and that concealed, in many places, level stone floors and cut steps and the traces of paths that ran in straight lines up hillsides too steep for casual travel. The Cherokee, Swimmer said, had not built these features. They had inherited them, and within a few generations of their arrival, before European contact, the forest had begun to close in. The undergrowth had returned, and the walking rooms had been swallowed by the same process of natural succession that any abandoned garden undergoes when its keepers stop tending it. The description matches, in precise and unsettling detail, the accounts left by the first European explorers who saw the southern Appalachians in the early 16th century. Hernando de Soto's chroniclers, passing through what is now Tennessee and North Carolina in 1540, described riding for days through open forest beneath massive canopies, forest so clear beneath that they could see for a mile between the trunks. Later English traders described the same conditions in the 17th century, and the naturalist William Bartram in the 1770s wrote of oak and chestnut forests in northern Georgia, so open and park-like that he compared them to a nobleman's estate in England. The standard explanation offered by 20th century historical ecology is that indigenous peoples maintained the open forest through regular controlled burns, and this explanation is partially correct. But it does not account for the Cherokee elders' own testimony that they were not the ones who had established the pattern. They were the inheritors of a much older maintenance regime, one that had been operating for so long before their arrival that the forest had settled into a shape that could only be sustained by continuous human effort at a scale the Cherokee themselves had never matched. If the Cherokee testimony is taken at face value, the implication is that the eastern hardwood forest of North America, from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, was for an unknown length of time before recorded history a managed landscape on a continental scale. Someone or something had cleared the undergrowth, maintained the paths, tended the mast-bearing trees, kept the fires cool and regular, and produced a forest that functioned more like an enormous cultivated grove than a wild eco. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back, system. And that regime had been in place long enough, and had ended long enough before the Cherokee arrived, that even the memory of who had established it had passed out of direct recall. What the Cherokee retained was the after effect, the inherited park, the traces of stone floors under the leaf litter, and the names of the peoples the elders believed had built it, the Nunahi and the Little People and the Moon-Eyed Ones, who were spoken of not as legend but as former neighbors. The parallel to what alternative history researchers have called the Tartaria question is difficult to miss. In both cases, the pattern is the same. A landscape of apparent age and grandeur, a built environment of stone and earth that exceeds the reported capacity of the peoples who inherited it, a body of oral testimony from the inheritors themselves that credits the construction to earlier populations who have since withdrawn or vanished, and a mainstream framework that has consistently declined to engage with that testimony except as folklore. The old forest of the southern Appalachians is not, in the strict sense, an architectural artifact, but it functions as one. It is a shaped environment on a continental scale, and its shaping is attributed by the Cherokee themselves to peoples they did not identify with. Whether those peoples were the moon-eyed inhabitants Barton recorded in 1797, or the Adena and Hopewell mound builders whose earthworks predate the Cherokee arrival, or something else entirely that has left no bones and no burials, is a question that Mooney's notebooks raise but do not resolve. Barton is worth mentioning in his own right, because his account is the earliest European reference to the moon-eyed people in print, and it predates Mooney's fieldwork by 90 years. Benjamin Smith Barton was a Philadelphia physician and naturalist who had studied under Linnaeus's students in Edinburgh, and who in 1797 published a small volume titled New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of America. In that book, he included a paragraph that has since been quoted often but examined carefully only rarely. Barton wrote that the Cherokee had informed him, through interpreters at meetings held in the 1780s, of a race of small, pale, bearded men who had inhabited the southern Appalachians before the Cherokee themselves, who could not endure the light of the sun, and who had been driven out of the region by Cherokee warriors and forced to travel westward. Barton speculated that these people might have been a Welsh colony descended from the legendary Prince Madoc, a theory that has since been thoroughly dismantled and that need not detain us. What is relevant is not Barton's speculation, but the underlying testimony he was recording. Cherokee informants in the 1780s were describing to a Philadelphia physician a pre-Cherokee population with distinct physical characteristics, a preference for night activity, and a specific historical trajectory of displacement. 90 years later, entirely independent Cherokee informants were describing to Mooney the same pre-Cherokee population with the same physical characteristics, the same nocturnal habits, and the same westward departure. Two ethnographic snapshots separated by nearly a century, taken from different communities of the Eastern Band, produced the same account. The Cherokee themselves, in the tradition Mooney gathered from several elders and cross-referenced against older written sources, did not consider themselves indigenous to the southern Appalachians in the sense that mainstream archaeology has assumed. Their migration account, as Swimmer and others told it, described a movement from the north and east into the mountains at a time understood to have been perhaps 20 or 30 generations before the arrival of Europeans. That count would place the Cherokee entry into the region somewhere in the range of 500 to 800 years before Mooney's fieldwork, which is broadly consistent with the linguistic evidence that the Cherokee language is Iroquoian in origin, and its speakers had migrated south from an ancestral homeland in the Great Lakes region. When the Cherokee arrived, according to the elders, the mountains were already occupied, and the occupants were the peoples Mooney would later record under the names of the Nunahi, the Yunwitsunsdi, and the Moon-Eyed Ones. The Cherokee had not exterminated these predecessors so much as displaced them, forcing them into remote coves and eventually into the invisible or subterranean condition in which they were said to persist. This is not a comfortable account for anyone committed to the idea of continuous indigenous occupation, and it has been treated in the professional literature as a mythological gloss on what must have been a straightforward process of cultural continuity. Mooney's own reading of the material was more cautious. He noted that the elders were consistent about naming their own arrival as an arrival, and about naming their predecessors as predecessors, and that whatever the historical reality behind these accounts, the Cherokee themselves had not understood themselves as the original people of the mountains. There is one further account in the notebooks that resists any easy classification. In a series of entries dated to the winter of 1889, Mooney recorded a story that Swimmer told him with unusual reluctance, insisting that it be written down only once and never spoken aloud in the Cherokee tongue in Mooney's presence. The story described a location in the Balsam Mountains, which Swimmer would not name precisely, where a level plateau of stone had been found beneath the leaf mold, a stone floor of perhaps an acre in extent, with the remains of low walls at its edges and a shallow basin cut into the center. The Cherokee, who had discovered it several generations before Swimmer's own lifetime, had understood the plateau to be the floor of a townhouse belonging to one of the earlier peoples, a townhouse whose walls and roof had long since gone, but whose foundation remained. They had not built anything on it, had not disturbed it, and had marked it as one of the places where the older forest was still nearer than usual. Swimmer told Mooney that the plateau was still there, that any Cherokee of the older generation could find it if they had reason to, and that no one had reason to. Mooney recorded the account, drew a rough sketch based on Swimmer's description, and never returned to investigate. The sketch is preserved in the archives. Its location has never been identified in modern times. Similar accounts appear in the oral traditions of neighboring peoples, and Mooney was aware of this. Among the Creek Confederacy, whose
I'm used to dealing with long periods without any written records, but that doesn't mean that nothing happened. I'm going to find out what really did happen in this mysterious time. And I'm going to start in the place where the collapse of the Roman government must have been most keenly felt, the city. The Romans built a network of civic centres across Britain. I went to York, one of the largest of these, to find out what happened after the legions left. Underneath the medieval city walls, it's possible to see the earliest layers of a city's rich history. Whilst the Roman and later Viking layers provide plenty of archaeological evidence, the elusive Dark Age layers contain few recognizable artifacts. It's almost as if the period is invisible to archaeologists. However, by the side of the Roman bridgehead in York, archaeologist Mark Wyman has made a breakthrough. By re-examining thousands of pieces of pottery thought to be part of the city's Roman history, he has begun to shed some light on the city's Dark Age past.
Okay, Francis, well, this is where we do the pottery. One thing that definitely does happen at the end of the 4th century in Britain is that coins disappeared. Coins are crucial to establish chronology.
But with no coins available, Mark had to find a new way of interpreting the evidence.
We were looking for a type of pottery that might have continued in production beyond the end of Roman Britain.
The pottery Mark was looking at could not be matched to any traditional Roman products. Well, why do you believe this rather strange-looking stuff is 5th century?
Well, this is what's known as calcite gritted ware.
Yeah.
It's a late Roman coarse pottery type, manufactured in huge quantities in East Yorkshire. The material we're looking at here is actually from a site excavated by the site of the Roman bridgehead in York.
The layers that produced Mark's pottery had to be dated later than the Roman period. This suggests that pottery was being manufactured in York after the Romans left. This business of making pottery in the 5th century has put the cat among the pigeons. Why is that?
The received view of Roman Britain, the one that's still quite widely held, I think, has been that Roman Britain's end is exceedingly sudden, and the archaeological material that we require to understand activity, to understand the past, just isn't being made. The reason I set out to do this research was to identify a type of artefact which we could say is manufactured in the 5th century, to argue against the idea of everything suddenly coming to a juddering halt.
Life in York did not come to a standstill in 410. Mark had found evidence for some kind of activity in the city after the Romans left, and he is not alone with these discoveries. All over the country, archaeologists are starting to piece together a picture of Dark Age Britain, very different from the conventional story of collapse. It's time to start rewriting the history books. Archaeology, like all humanities, is a product of its time. And Victorian archaeologists were part of a British Empire which compared itself to Rome. So they had every reason to suggest that when great empires collapse, disaster and chaos follow. Amid the gentle hills of the Shropshire countryside lie the remains of the Roman town of Wroxeter. The romantic ruins fascinated early antiquarians, who saw it as an evocative reminder of a great civilization which had fallen into ruin. Wroxeter was first excavated in the 19th century. These Victorian archaeologists were so excited by the Roman remains here that they did not spot something that would completely rewrite the history of the town. It wasn't until the 1980s that archaeologists discovered the real story of Wroxeter.
As they wandered over the rubble, he found these 2 large round stones. The inspector said, well, perhaps these are the same. They noticed lines of packed rubble and plaster. And they suddenly realised they had this massive, great building. It was so big that it was a bit like trying to see an elephant standing a foot away. The north wall was taken down, dismantled, and the rubble was used to create a huge building platform. What they were doing was making a solid foundation onto which they could then build a timber frame structure. The dating was the major problem. The big building and all the other buildings around it had to fit in between about 520 and about 590, 600.
So, I mean, we're long, long after the official end of Roman Britain in 410, aren't we? And they're building huge buildings Romans, aren't they?
They are Romans. This is our perception that we think of Romans as being foreigners who come over, occupy the country, and then go away again. They weren't. The people in the country Romanised. They became Roman.
I mean, central control, central administration had sort of broken down. So, I mean, who was organising? Was it an Arthur-like character?
It's a very difficult question to answer because you have no evidence. But if you think about it, this is like trying to answer the question of who lives in Buckingham Palace foundations. What we can say, however, is that this person had power. So they are someone who's able to command authority. There is a structure to the society.
The discoveries of Wroxeter were a great advance in archaeology. They opened the way for archaeologists to re-examine other Roman sites in Britain to discover what happened during the so-called Dark Ages. Hadrian's Wall was one of the most important military sites in Roman Britain. Stretching from coast to coast, the wall includes a series of garrison forts. In its heyday, this was a bustling community of soldiers and their families defending the northern fringes of the empire. What happened after the Roman army pulled out has long been a mystery. It used to be believed that King Arthur fought his final battle of Camlan near this remote, windy spot on Hadrian's Wall. But recent work has shown that within the fort of Burd Oswald, there was an altogether more extraordinary archaeological story to tell. Burd Oswald is the most westerly of the series of forts which lined the wall. Miriam Lincoln showed me round the remains of this military headquarters.
This is the main road through the fort, buildings either side, huge drilled hall, granaries to the south here.
It was the granaries that archaeologist Tony Wilmot decided to examine when he began excavation here.
I just had a feeling from looking around the site that late Roman would survive quite well. And a chap in one corner said, Tony, I think we've got a bit of a straight line here. And there's a chap in another corner said, it's a right angle. And I basically went to the top of the tower, the farmhouse, looked down, and there's just this great rectangle sitting there.
Above the stone foundations of the Roman granaries, Tony discovered the remains of a huge structure which was built long after the Roman troops withdrew. It was a unique archaeological discovery. What was it like?
It's just jaw dropped, you know. You're thinking, God, this is it, really, you know.
You've got this lovely, huge, open structure, thatched roof, and it would be the first thing you saw as you came through the gateway there.
Michael, one of my most experienced diggers, just to give a very quick clean to this slide, trench. And I didn't tell her what I was looking for. And I said, anything odd about this? And she said, there's these sort of hard, flat patches. Oh, where are they? She went, well, there's one here, and I pointed to that.
Yeah.
And there's one here, and I pointed to that. And sure enough, they paired up. It was completely objective because I hadn't told her what I was doing. That's how it became confirmed.
The strange markings that Tony found were the remains of 12 footings which formed the skeleton of an enormous wooden hall that had been built after the Roman troops departed. So what kind of a group of men built a building like that? I mean, it's a socking great big thing.
I think the key is there's no break to the commander, perhaps even a hereditary commander by this point, would have become a central authority. And you can see that kind of gradually morphing into the idea of a petty king or a petty leader.
Are we talking about a sort of protection racket?
It's not hard to see them saying, well, okay, carry on paying your Roman taxes and we'll carry on seeing you were right. And from taxation to protection racket is perhaps not such a huge jump.
The history books tell us Roman soldiers turned out the lights and darkness descended.
That's it, yeah. It wasn't happening here. These were native Britons. They had nowhere to go. This was home, and so had to find a living somehow. Certainly there was no mass withdrawal from Bird Oswald.
Do you reckon there are more lake forts along Hadrian's Wall?
I think there's certain to be. These communities didn't just disappear. If you're sitting pretty behind some high stone walls, you're not just going to disappear and start practicing subsistence farming. You're going to stay put. There's started to be evidence from a number of places now that this sort of thing took place. Perhaps Bird Oswald is just one of a network of fortified centres to growing up. You could go down to the southwest, you've got hill forts being reoccupied. I think that we should see Bird Oswald as one of those, rather than being part of the Roman frontier system at that time. Everything's changed.
Yeah. To the east of Bird Oswald is a lake called Crag Loch. From here, archaeologists have extracted soil samples to construct a picture of how the landscape changed when the Roman troops pulled out. This process, known as pollen analysis, involves examining the types of trees that once grew here. I like trees, which is why I've planted them on my farm. But to archaeologists, the presence of trees on land that had once been farmed shows that the countryside has been abandoned. And in the Dark Ages, the traditional view is that the countryside reverted to a wild wood once the Romans had withdrawn. The work at Crag Loch challenges this view. It was carried out by Petra Dark of Reading University.
Pollen analysis gives us really good evidence for what the countryside of the past was like. We can actually identify the pollen grains of different plants, like the trees, the cereals, and so on. And we can count the pollen samples taken through cores of sediment and reconstruct vegetation change over long timescales.
Petra is able to build up a picture of what the landscape looked like hundreds of years ago.
If we get cereal pollen, that tells us that they're growing crops nearby. If we have tree pollen, that tells us there was woodland nearby. And this is very important for reconstructing changes in farming in the past, because we can see were they farming very intensively or had areas of land being abandoned to farming, in which case they quite rapidly revert to woodland.
By carbon dating the samples, Petra is able to tell when a landscape changed.
By the Roman period, this is quite an open landscape. A lot of the woodland's gone.
Petra's charts clearly show that at Hadrian's Wall there was not a massive increase in forest when the Romans pulled out.
By the end of the Roman period, we start to get an increase of birch pollen. But the other trees are not really changing, so there isn't massive woodland regeneration happening.
Contrary to popular belief, the landscape at Hadrian's Wall did not revert to forest when the Romans left. Petra has compared samples from a selection of sites across Britain. While some do see an increase in woodland, at many the land continued to be farmed in exactly the same way. And in certain places, land use actually intensified after the Romans departed.
We can't generalise across the whole of the landscape in the way that, in the 1950s, before we had this evidence, there was this generalisation. That's much too simple a picture.
Petra's work demolishes the vision of Britain reverting to wildwood once the Romans departed. In forts like Bird Oswald and towns like Wroxeter, the end of Roman administration did not bring about the breakdown of society. Released from the controlling hand of Rome, new leaders emerged and society regrouped. But this new independence did not mean that Britain had cut herself off from the rest of the world. A series of extraordinary contacts were about to be made with some of the most powerful players in the ancient world. At Tintagel, on the Atlantic coast of Cornwall, there is a rugged promontory. This dramatic site has long been associated with the Dark Age warrior King Arthur. gigantic place for the Britons. And I'm not surprised that Arthur is supposed to have been conceived in a castle here. The trouble is, those dramatic ruins over there are 13th century and have nothing whatsoever to do with Arthur or with Camelot. King Arthur first became associated with Tintagel when the author Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a version of a legend in which King Arthur is born here. The Earl of Cornwall decided to build an Arthurian-style castle on the headland. Tourists have been coming here ever since to catch a glimpse of Camelot. However, the Dark Age story of Tintagel is far more exciting. Excavations here have shed new light on Britain's ancient contacts with the rest of the world. Charles Thomas explains.
This is the classic way to see it, to approach it, because we've got the island, we've got that neck there, and you can see most...
The creature 20 to 30 feet long, reptilian, a serpentine body covered in overlapping scales the size of a man's palm, a long muscular neck that lifts the head above the height of a horse, a skull longer than a sword, set with rows of teeth, short clawed forelimbs close to the chest, hind legs powerful enough for ambush, a tail half the body's length, heavy enough to break stone. Every ancient civilization on Earth, Sumerian, Egyptian, Chinese, Greek, Roman, Norse, Welsh, Aztec, Aboriginal, independently described exactly this animal. The same proportions, the same predator. They all hunted it, and every one of them had a word for it. 256 BC, late summer. The Bagradus River, somewhere in what is now northern Tunisia. A Roman army under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus is camped on the riverbank during the First Punic War. The men have been marching for weeks. The river is their only water source for 50 miles in any direction. Then something comes out of the river. The Roman historians Pliny the Elder, Livy, Valerius Maximus, and the poet Silius Italicus will all write about what happens next in matter-of-fact military prose, the way you describe a battle you won. The thing kills several legionaries. Regulus orders ballistae, the army's heavy siege catapults, turned on it. The fight takes hours. When the legion finally kills it, the soldiers measure the body. 120 Roman feet. They flay it. They strip the jaws. They send the skin and the jawbones back to Rome, where they are mounted in a temple on the Capitoline Hill and displayed publicly for the next 123 years. Roman senators walked past that skin every week. Nobody called it a myth. The Senate recorded the measurement. The historians who wrote about it described it in the same prose voice they used for naval battles and triumphs. And by the time the skin finally disappears from the temple records, every history book has stopped describing what it was. There is a chain hanging outside Wawel Cathedral in Krakow, Poland. From the chain hang 3 large bones, mounted side by side at the western entrance of the cathedral that sits on Wawel Hill above the old city. They have been there since at least the 14th century. Cathedral records describe them as the bones of the dragon that once lived in the cave beneath the hill. The dragon that, according to Polish chronicles dating back to the 12th century writings of Wincenty Kadlubek, was killed during the reign of King Cracus, the founder of the city. Modern scientific examination of the bones, when it was finally permitted in the 20th century, identified them as a whale rib, the femur of a woolly mammoth, and the leg bone of a Pleistocene rhinoceros. The official explanation is satisfying. They are not dragon bones. The medieval Polish identification was wrong. Mystery solved. Except for one detail that nobody addresses. Medieval Poles had never seen a whale. They did not know mammoths had existed. The woolly mammoth would not be formally described to European science until 1796, more than 400 years after these bones were already hanging at Wawel. The rhinoceros was an animal of distant Africa to them, not the Pleistocene Eurasian steppe. And yet, out of all the bones available to them, out of every ossuary and battlefield and butcher in Poland, they chose 3 specific bones from 3 specific creatures, all functionally unknown to them, that when arranged together form the approximate skeleton of an animal that was not supposed to exist. Open every ancient civilization's records, and you find the same creature described independently, in
in cultures that had no contact with each other, using anatomical detail that does not match anything you can buy at a market or see at a temple. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian Mushushu appears on the Ishtar Gate of Babylon, completed around 575 BC under Nebuchadnezzar II. The gate is now reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Reproductions stand at the original site in Iraq. The animal depicted is not stylized in the way mythological creatures usually are. It has the forelegs of a feline, the hind legs of a raptor, a scaled body, a serpentine neck and tail, a forked tongue, and a horn on the head. Babylonian texts describe it not as a god, but as a creature that the god Marduk subdued, present tense, as a real thing. In the same sentences that describe lions and bulls, the Ishtar Gate alternates Mushushu with aurochs and lions in its decorative bands. The aurochs and the lions are zoologically accurate. The Mushushu is depicted with the same precision. In Egypt, Apep, the great serpent. In dynastic art, the snake is depicted at scales that no known Nile snake matches, with anatomical features that suggest the artists were drawing from something other than the cobra and python they had at hand. In China, the dragon is older than the state itself. Bones sold in Chinese apothecaries for over 2,000 years under the name Longgu, meaning dragon bones, turned out, when Western paleontologists finally analysed them in the early 20th century, to be fossilized remains of Mesozoic dinosaurs, Pleistocene mammals, and the now extinct giant ape, Gigantopithecus. Chinese paleontology effectively began with people noticing what their pharmacies had been grinding into medicine for millennia. The bones the apothecaries called dragons were real bones from real creatures. The Chinese had been touching them, naming them, and identifying them with their own visual tradition for so long that the words for fossil and for dragon were, in many medieval Chinese medical texts, interchangeable. In Greece, the dragon is in Hesiod, in Homer, in Apollodorus, but the most important text is Pliny the Elder, writing in 77 AD. His natural history runs to 37 volumes and remains the most comprehensive single work on the ancient world's understanding of the natural world. Book 8 is the book on land animals. In it, alongside elephants and lions and rhinoceroses, Pliny describes dragons. He does not describe them as supernatural. He gives them habitats, Ethiopia, India. He gives them measurements, up to 20 cubits, roughly 30 feet. He gives them behaviors. They hunt elephants, wrapping around the elephant's legs and crushing them, then drinking the blood. He describes specific anatomical features, the way they slither in coils, the way they raise the head to strike, the way they fight in pairs. This is not a man writing about myths. This is a Roman senator and naval commander writing a science book, describing dragons in the same prose voice he uses to describe rhinoceroses and crocodiles. The Roman army carried a Draco standard, a metal serpent head mounted on a pole with a long fabric tube that hissed in the wind when cavalry charged. The Romans had not invented it. They had borrowed it from the Sarmatians and the Dacians, who had borrowed it from earlier steppe cultures, who had borrowed it from somewhere further back. The standard was specifically modelled on a serpent with a wide gaping jaw and a long ribboned body, an animal the cavalry knew well enough to make their banner of, in the same way a modern military insignia uses an eagle or a wolf. In Northern Europe, the same pattern. The Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf describes a dragon that lives in a burial mound, hoards gold, and is finally killed by the king at the cost of his own life. The Norse Jormungandr, the world serpent. Nidhogger, the dragon that gnaws the roots of Yggdrasil. The Welsh Ydraig Goch, the red dragon, attested in the medieval Mabinogion. Every Celtic culture has its dragon. Every Germanic culture has its dragon. Every Slavic culture has its dragon, called Zmei. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, depicted in the murals of Teotihuacan and the pyramids of the Yucatan. In Polynesia, the Taniwha. In Australia, the rainbow serpent of Aboriginal oral tradition, a being so old in the cultural memory that it predates anything modern archaeology can reliably date. These civilizations did not share myths. They did not borrow stories from each other. Sumerian Babylon was not in contact with the Aztec lowlands. The Welsh oral tradition was not informed by the Han Chinese pharmacopoeia. The Anglo-Saxon Scop did not read Pliny. The Aboriginal Australians did not exchange folklore with the Polynesians until very late in human history. And yet every one of them, working in isolation, produced the same basic creature, a large reptilian animal, often associated with water, with specific anatomical features that recur with disturbing consistency. Serpentine body, often legs, often a horned or crested head, often described in connection with hunting or being hunted by humans. The simple explanation is that humans like to make up similar monsters. This is the position of mainstream folklore studies, and it is not wrong exactly in the sense that humans do share psychological patterns. But it does not explain why the dragons of these cultures are described with the same anatomical specificity as the elephants and the lions and the crocodiles. Pliny does not describe Apollo with the same prose voice he uses for animals. He describes dragons that way. So does Aristotle. So does the Sumerian scribe. There is a different explanation. It is the one nobody in the academy will name out loud. Something happens to the dragon between roughly 400 AD and 1600 AD. It changes from an animal to a saint's adversary, and then it disappears entirely. The first sign is the Christian saint cycle. Beginning in the 4th and 5th centuries, accounts begin appearing across Europe and the Mediterranean of holy men killing dragons. St. George kills a dragon at Cyllene in Libya somewhere in the late 3rd century. St. Margaret of Antioch is swallowed by a dragon and bursts from its belly. St. Martha tames the Tarasque, a creature with a lion's head, 6 bear-like legs, a scaled body, and a serpent's tail, in the town of Tarascon in Provence. The Tarasque story has a specific date, the 1st century AD, and a specific location, and the town of Tarascon still holds an annual festival commemorating the event, complete with a wooden effigy of the Tarasque carried through the streets. The festival is documented from at least the 15th century. St. Patrick drives serpents from Ireland. St. Hilarion kills a dragon in Dalmatia. St. Donatus of Arezzo, St. Theodore of Amasea, St. Mercurialis of Forli. By the year 1000, every major Christian region of Europe has at least one local dragon-slaying saint, often dozens. The pattern is consistent. The accounts shift from the older form, where armies and kings hunt dragons in the open, to the new form, where a single holy figure ends the threat permanently. The dragon goes from being a population of animals to being a singular last creature. And in every account, the holy figure does not study the creature, does not preserve it, does not describe its anatomy. The holy figure kills it. The body is rarely produced. In England, the Lambton worm is killed by John Lambton, returning crusader, around the year 1420. In Poland, the Wawel dragon is killed by Scuba the shoemaker, who feeds it a sulphur-stuffed sheep. The body is consumed by fire. Nothing is preserved. In Germany, in France, in Russia, the same pattern. The dragons end with a single act of violence, attributed to a single hero, with the carcass either burned, dissolved, or buried in unconsecrated ground where no one is permitted to dig. But there is one period, between roughly 1500 and 1700, when European scholarship still treats dragons as real animals. Konrad Gessner, the Swiss naturalist credited with founding modern zoological taxonomy, publishes his Historia Animalium between 1551 and 1558. It is a 5-volume encyclopedia of all known animals, illustrated, classified, with descriptions of anatomy, behaviour, and habitat. It is a foundational text of European biology, used by university lecturers for nearly 200 years after its publication. And it contains dragons. Gessner classifies them. He describes their varieties. He notes regional differences. He distinguishes them from snakes, and from the imaginary creatures he is careful to mark as fabulous. The dragons are not in that category. They are in the same category as the giraffe and the elk. Athanasius Kircher, the 17th century Jesuit polymath, includes dragons in his Mundus Subterraneus of 1665, a survey of subterranean geography that influenced European science for over a century. Kircher does not present them as folklore. He he presents them with anatomical drawings and discusses their habitats in cave systems and underground rivers. He cites accounts from named witnesses. He references bones he says he examined personally in collections across Europe. And then, within a single century, all of this disappears. Georges Cuvier, the French naturalist often called the founder of modern paleontology, begins publishing in the late 1790s. His work establishes the principle of extinction, the idea that species can vanish, can be gone forever, can exist only in fossils. By the 1820s, Cuvier and his successors have established a new framework. Bones that earlier generations called dragon bones are now classified as the remains of extinct species. Mammoths, mastodons, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, bones at Varvel are reclassified. The Chinese longu are reclassified. The fossils in European caves are reclassified. And the word dragon is removed from the scientific vocabulary entirely, retained only as a name for a small Indonesian lizard nobody has yet seen. The shift is not gradual. It is not a slow accumulation of evidence that displaces an older view. It is a sudden professional decision made in a small number of European institutions that takes effect across the entire scientific world within 2 generations. By 1850, no respectable European naturalist will mention dragons except as a category of folklore. By 1900, the word survives in the West almost entirely in the names of fantasy creatures and in pub signs. And while this is happening, while Cuvier and his successors are reclassifying every dragon bone in Europe, something else is going on in the Indonesian archipelago that nobody in Europe notices. There is, on the island of Komodo and a few nearby islands of the Lesser Sundas, a population of giant reptiles. Adults reach over 3 meters in length and can weigh more than 70 kilograms. They are apex predators. They hunt deer, wild boar, water buffalo, and, on occasion, humans. They have been known to local fishermen for centuries. The islands sit on major shipping routes that Dutch, Portuguese, and Arab traders had been using for hundreds of years. In 1910, a Dutch colonial officer named Lieutenant Jacques Karel Henri van Steen van Hensbroek hears the local stories. He sails to Komodo. He shoots one. He sends the skin and a photograph to the Zoological Museum in Buitenzorg in Java. The director of the museum, Peter Owens, publishes a description in 1912. The Komodo dragon enters the Western scientific record. It is 1912. Cuvier has been dead for 80 years. The official position of European zoology has been for nearly a century that giant predatory lizards do not exist on Earth in the modern era. And here is one. On a shipping route the West has been using for 400 years. Now consider what should bother you about the Komodo discovery. It is not that the Komodo dragon exists. It is that the official scientific consensus for the entire 19th century was that creatures like this had been gone for millions of years. And the consensus persisted on a continent surrounded by islands where local fishermen, for generations, had been describing exactly such a creature to anyone who would listen. The information was available. The shipping logs are full of references to giant lizards on those islands. The Dutch East India Company had records. Sailors traded stories in port. The local Bugis and Bajau peoples knew the animals well enough to give them names, to give them habits, to give them territories. What was missing was not evidence. What was missing was permission. Until a uniformed European officer shot one and sent the skin to a colonial museum, the existence of the animal was not real in the sense that academic science was prepared to acknowledge. This is what Adrienne Mayer, a research scholar in classics and history of science at Stanford, has been arguing for over 2 decades. Her book, The First Fossil Hunters, published by Princeton University Press in 2000, examines how ancient civilizations interpreted the bones of extinct creatures. Her core argument is that many ancient monsters, griffins, cyclopes, dragons, emerged from real encounters with fossils that pre-scientific cultures interpreted as the remains of real animals from their own ecological past. past. Mayer is not arguing that dragons literally existed in the form children's books describe them. She is arguing for something subtler and, in some ways, more disturbing. She is arguing that the ancient classification of these bones was not delusional. It was a different system, one that integrated direct observation with cultural memory in ways modern science has discarded. The implication, which Mayer herself is careful not to push too far, is that the ancients were doing rough paleontology, and that the creatures they described were the creatures their bones came from, scaled and reconstructed in ways the moderns find naive, but which were not wrong about the existence of the animals, only about their timing. The timing is the key, because in some cases, the timing was not actually as wrong as Cuvier's framework would suggest. In Australia, beginning in the 1850s, Sir Richard Owen, the British paleontologist who coined the word dinosaur, began describing fossils of a giant monitor lizard he named Megalania prisca, ancient great Roma. Adult Megalania reached 6 to 7 meters in length and weighed up to 600 kilograms. It was, by every available measure, the largest terrestrial lizard ever to exist. Its closest living relative is the Komodo dragon, which is essentially a small surviving cousin of the same lineage. For decades, Megalania was thought to have gone extinct in the early Pleistocene, hundreds of thousands of years before humans arrived in Australia. Then, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s and 2000s, the dating got better. Recalibrated radiocarbon dates pushed Megalania's extinction forward to roughly 50,000 years ago, possibly less. Aboriginal Australians have been in Australia for at least 65,000 years. Megalania and humans overlapped on the same continent for at least 15,000 years, and quite possibly much longer. There are Aboriginal oral traditions that describe creatures with extraordinary specificity that match Megalania more closely than they match anything alive today. The same recalibration occurred for Quincana, a terrestrial crocodile of Australia, 3 to 6 meters long, walking on long legs the way modern crocodiles cannot. Quincana survived into the late Pleistocene. It overlapped with humans, and it is named after the Quincans, spirit creatures of Aboriginal mythology in northern Queensland, described as tall, sinewy figures that lived in rock crevices and hunted at night. The same recalibration for Wanambi narracortensis, a giant constrictor snake 5 to 6 meters long, also Pleistocene Australian. The Aboriginal rainbow serpent tradition, present across the entire continent, is in some interpretations a direct cultural memory of Wanambi. What the Australian record demonstrates is simple and difficult to dismiss. Giant reptiles existed alongside humans on at least one continent into geologically recent times. They survived long enough to enter the oral tradition of the people who lived with them. They became part of cultural memory before they vanished from the landscape. And the timing of their vanishing correlates on every inhabited continent that has been studied with the arrival and expansion of human populations. This is the late Quaternary extinction event. The Americas lose mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, glyptodons, and giant beavers within a few thousand years of human arrival. Europe loses cave bears, cave lions, woolly mammoths, and woolly rhinos in the same window. Madagascar loses giant lemurs and elephant birds within historical time. The elephant bird may have survived to around 1200 AD, well within the period of European awareness. New Zealand loses the moa and Haast's eagle, the largest eagle that ever lived, after Polynesian settlement in roughly 1300 AD. Every continent, every island chain, the same pattern. Humans arrive, megafauna disappears. The largest, slowest breeding, most visible species go first, and nothing similar evolves to replace them. What gets called dragons in the cultural record, in many cases may simply be the megafauna that did not survive long enough for modern biology to catalogue. The Bagrada serpent, the Wavell dragon, the Tarasque, the Lambton worm, the dragons of Pliny. These may not all be the same animal, but the pattern of how they are described, how they are killed, and how the carcasses always seem to disappear before any naturalist can study them, is consistent across 2,000 years of historical record. And there is one more piece of evidence that does not appear in any of the standard accounts. The European cave bear, Ursus spelaeus, went extinct around 24,000 years ago in mainland Europe. Its remains are found in caves throughout the Alps. In 1917, the Swiss archaeologist Emil Bachler began excavating the Drachenloch cave in eastern Switzerland. He found bear skulls and bones arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate human placement. Skulls in stone-lined niches, long bones stacked in piles. The conventional interpretation is Paleolithic bear cult ritual, and the dating is disputed, but the cave itself raises a different question. The cave is called Drachenloch, dragon hole. The name predates Bachler's excavation by centuries. It was the local Swiss name for the cave for as long as records exist for the village nearby. The local oral tradition called the bones inside dragon bones. The medieval Swiss did not know what a cave bear was. They had never seen one. The cave bear had been extinct for over 20,000 years before any Swiss village existed in that valley. And yet the cave was called the Dragon Hole, and the bones inside were dragon bones, and the people who named it had identified, without paleontological training, the remains of an enormous extinct predator and assigned them the category they had a word for. I have to be honest about where this research lost me and where it got me back. The first time I read about the Bagrada's serpent, I dismissed it. Roman exaggeration. Pliny was a good observer of nature, but he also believed in basilisks and werewolves, and the line between his careful zoology and his folklore is not always clear. The 120-foot measurement is obviously wrong. The skin in the temple was probably a snakeskin sewn together with embellishments. The whole account is the kind of patriotic war story Rome loved to tell about itself. That was where I planted my flag, and then I started checking what every other ancient civilization had said about similar creatures. Then I started looking at the megafauna extinction data. Then I noticed that the timing did not work out the way I had been taught. Then I sat with the Wawel bones for a long while, with the question of why medieval Polish people had identified the remains of 3 creatures they had never seen and never could have seen, and assembled them in the rough shape of an animal they had a name for in their own language. There is a way to dismiss any single piece of this. There is no good way to dismiss all of it together. I want to be careful here. I am not saying dragons existed in the form children's books describe them. I am saying the official explanation that every culture across every continent independently invented broadly similar creatures with broadly similar anatomy out of pure imagination is the explanation that requires the most coincidence. So consider what the pattern actually shows. Every ancient civilization on every continent describes a category of large reptilian creature. They describe it with anatomical specificity that matches no living animal those cultures had access to. They describe it being hunted by humans in language that does not treat the creature as supernatural. They preserve, in some cases, physical remains, skin, bones, jaws, teeth, which are displayed in temples and cathedrals and pharmacies for centuries before being either lost, destroyed, or reclassified. Then, beginning in roughly the 4th century AD and accelerating through the medieval period, the killing of the creature is reassigned. It moves from a thing armies do to a thing saints do, from a population of animals to a singular last specimen, from an event recorded by historians to a miracle recorded by hagiographers. The bodies stop being preserved. The jaws stop being mounted in temples. The hunts stop being measured. Then, in a single generation in the early 19th century, the entire category is removed from scientific vocabulary. The bones are reclassified as fossils of other species. The folklore is reclassified as universal human imagination. The remaining oral traditions are reclassified as primitive superstition. Within 2 generations, no European institution will discuss the subject seriously. And then, in 1910, on an island that ships have been passing for 4 centuries, a Dutch officer shoots a giant lizard. This is the pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The same shape repeats in every domain. The thing that was real becomes contested. The contested thing becomes folkloric. The folkloric thing becomes professionally taboo. The professional taboo becomes the new common sense. And then, every so often, a fragment of the original reality slips through. A Komodo, a coelacanth, declared extinct for 65 million years and then pulled out of a fisherman's net in South Africa in 1938. A giant squid, finally photographed alive in 2004 after centuries of being officially impossible. And the institutions reclassify quietly in technical journals and move on as if the previous century of denial had never happened. What was hunted to extinction here was not only animals, it was a way of looking at the natural world that admitted the existence of things larger and stranger than the institutions are prepared to acknowledge. The ancients did not see dragons because they were primitive. They saw dragons because dragons, in some form, large surviving reptiles, megafauna remnants, predators that humans encountered and eliminated, were there. The medieval and early modern Europeans did not put bones at the cathedral because they were credulous. They put bones at the cathedral because the bones were what was left of an animal their grandparents' grandparents had still been telling stories about killing. The institutions did not erase dragons because dragons were untrue. They erased dragons because the alternative, admitting that human expansion across the planet had hunted into extinction a category of animals so large and consequential that every culture on Earth retained a memory of them, was too large a story to fit into the 19th century's idea of progress. The story of dragons is the story of what humans did to the last of the megafauna in every place we went. The Komodo dragon survived only because it lived on islands so small and remote that we had not yet exhausted them. The Megalania did not. The Quincana did not. The Wanambi did not. The Bagrada serpent did not. Whatever the European cave bear actually was in the imagination of the people who lived in fear of it, did not. And the killing did not stop in 256 BC, or in the year of St. George, or in 1420 with John Lambton. The killing is the constant. The naming is what changes. Stella's sea cow, an animal the size of a small whale, was described to Western science by Georg Stella in 1741. 27 years later, in 1768, it was extinct. Hunted to nothing in less than 3 decades after its discovery. The thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, photographed and filmed in the 20th century, declared extinct in 1936. The Yangtze River dolphin, a real animal that lived alongside humans for tens of thousands of years in Chinese cultural memory, declared functionally extinct in 2006. The pattern does not require coordination. It does not require conspiracy. It requires only what humans have always done. Kill the large thing. Eat the large thing. Eliminate the predator. Take the territory. And then forget what we eliminated, because the alternative is to look at what we did. The dragons in the cathedral, in the temple, in the apothecary, in the cave. Those bones are not telling us about creatures that did not exist. They are telling us about creatures that did exist, that humans encountered, that humans killed, and that humans then, generation by generation, agreed to remember as myths rather than as casualties. The reclassification by Cuvier and his successors was not a lie. It was something more functional than a lie. It was the moment a civilization decided that the things it had eliminated had never been real in the first place, because if they had been real, then their absence would be an indictment, and a civilization that had just declared itself the pinnacle of progress could not afford that indictment in its founding scientific documents. The skin in the temple on the Capitoline Hill was there for 123 years. Roman senators walked past it. Roman children visited it. Roman historians described it. It was a public artifact in a public building in the capital of the largest empire in the Mediterranean world. And then, somewhere between the late Republic and the early Empire, the skin disappears from the record. No one is recorded as having destroyed it. No one is recorded as having moved it. It is simply mentioned for the last time in a text from around 133 BC, during the Numantine War, and then it is gone. Not lost, not stolen. It simply stops being mentioned, the way a thing stops being mentioned when the people who care about it die, and their grandchildren find the question embarrassing. I keep returning to the same questions. Why did every isolated civilization on Earth describe the same category of creature with the same anatomical detail? Why did the killing transfer from kings and armies to saints in the same window across Europe? Why are the bodies always gone before the modern scientific record begins? Why was the Komodo dragon, an apex predator on a shipping lane, undocumented by Western science until 1910? Why are the bones at Varvel hanging from a chain made of 3 specific species that the people who hung them there could not possibly have identified by name? Why does the European cave called the Dragon Hole contain the bones of an animal extinct for 20,000 years before any human ever named the cave? Why does every continent humans arrived on lose its megafauna within the first few thousand years of our presence? Why is the Komodo dragon a tourist attraction, and the Megalania a museum specimen, and the Varvel bones a curiosity, but the question that connects them is not in any textbook? The information is in the archives. The bones are still in the cathedrals. The texts of Pliny and Marco Polo and Conrad Gessner are on library shelves. The Komodo dragon is in zoos. The Megalania fossils are in Australian museums. None of this is hidden. All of it sits in the open, waiting for someone to look at the whole picture rather than the individual pieces. The Bagrada skin is gone. The senators are gone. The temple is gone. The measurement remains. 120 Roman feet. Recorded in the registers of the Republic by men who walked past the skin every week of their adult lives. Nobody called it a myth.
A water-damaged parchment leaf sits in a cedar box inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, Ethiopia, part of a manuscript collection that has not left that building in over 400 years. It contains chapters from the Book of Enoch. Church leaders voted Enoch out of Scripture in 364 CE, banned it, buried it, called it dangerous. For 17 centuries it stayed that way. Then in 1947, 11 copies surfaced in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. More copies than were found of Deuteronomy, more than Exodus, more than most books that stayed in the Bible. Scholars who translated the oldest fragments found something no one expected. Enoch describes a prison beneath the ocean floor, not a metaphor, a sealed chamber constructed before the flood, holding beings God chose not to destroy, only to contain. He names what's inside. He describes the door. He records why it cannot be opened until the final judgment. In the next several minutes, you will see what the text says, what modern deep-sea research has found in the same location, and why access to the relevant manuscripts has been restricted since 1974. If forbidden biblical history fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The passage appears in 2 places. The first is Enoch chapters 17 through 19, part of the Book of the Watchers. The second is Enoch chapter 69, in the Parables section, fragment 4Q206, stored at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, contains Aramaic text from chapter 17 dated to around 100 BCE. The Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscript at Aksum contains the complete version of both sections. Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford translation remains the standard English edition for scholars, identified chapter 17 as containing geographical language inconsistent with symbolic literature. He meant the text uses compass directions, depth measurements, specific terrain features, not the vague spiritual geography of apocalyptic writing. Something more like a survey report, the kind a geologist files after mapping a site. And this is where it gets disturbing. Chapter 17, verse 5, describes Enoch being taken to a place beyond the Great Sea, where the waters above and below converge. The Ge'ez uses Bahi Abi, the Great Sea, not a river, not a lake, an ocean. Verse 7 describes the floor of this place as dark stone, smooth and cold, unlike any stone found on land. Dark, smooth, cold. Enoch is describing basalt, the volcanic rock that forms the ocean floor. He had no way to know the ocean floor is paved in basalt. No ancient human had seen it. The deepest any ancient person could dive was perhaps 100 feet. The ocean floor sits 2 miles down on average and nearly 7 miles deep at its lowest. Yet Enoch describes it accurately. What we're looking at is a 3-part description of what lies beneath. The text begins with the structure. Chapter 18, verse 9 says, Enoch was shown a deep place in the earth, and columns of fire descended into it, and I saw pillars of fire falling downward without end. This is hydrothermal activity, underwater volcanic vents that shoot superheated water into the ocean, some reaching temperatures of 750 degrees Fahrenheit. The ancients called them pillars of fire. We call them black smokers. Same phenomenon, different century. But the text doesn't stop there. What follows in chapter 18, verse 11, is the prison itself. Enoch writes, and beyond the pillars of fire I saw a great house built from stones of hail and ice, and it had walls of fire around it, and a door I could not open. A house of ice surrounded by fire, impenetrable. Chapter 19, verse 1 identifies what is inside. The angel Uriel tells Enoch, here shall the angels who cohabited with women stand, their spirits taking many forms, defile men and lead them astray to offer sacrifices to demons as to gods. These are not the same as the watchers imprisoned beneath the desert. These are different beings. Their spirits, the text says, are still active, still able to influence events on the surface, even while the bodies are sealed below. The prison contains their physical forms. Their influence escapes through the door. What follows in chapter 69 is stranger still. Enoch provides the name of the being who manages the seal. Verse 14 names him as Caspiel, described as the one who revealed the secret oath to the holy Michael. The oath is what keeps the door shut. Chapter 69, verse 15 records the oath itself. The oath Bika, sworn before creation. Before the ocean existed, before the floor was laid, the seal on this prison was agreed upon before the prison was built. It was planned. The containment of whatever lives beneath the ocean floor was not a response to an emergency. It was a design decision. The distinction matters. Enoch describes 2 separate categories of imprisoned beings. The watchers under the Judean desert are awaiting trial. They are held in temporary detention before sentencing. But the beings beneath the ocean are described differently. Chapter 19, verse 3 adds a detail most Western translations drop entirely. The Ge'ez says their imprisonment is li'alam we'ale'em, for ages upon ages. That phrase appears elsewhere in Enoch, only in context describing permanent conditions. Not a holding cell, a permanent installation. Whatever is under the ocean floor was not detained to await judgment. It was removed from the world and sealed away from it indefinitely. What makes this detail unsettling is the reason given. God did not destroy these beings. He could have. The flood destroyed everything on the surface. But these beings were sealed rather than eliminated. Chapter 10, verse 9 records God's instruction, destroy all the souls of lust and the children of the watchers. Surface beings, destroyed. But chapter 19 describes a different class of being that receives a different sentence, containment instead of destruction, sealing instead of annihilation. The text implies these beings could not simply be unmade, they had to be held. The architecture Enoch describes is worth slowing down on. He doesn't say a dark place, he gives materials. Chapter 18, verse 9 specifies the walls are made of stones of hail, ice compressed under enormous pressure, white, blue, and translucent. The floor is that dark basalt, smooth and cold to the touch. Fire burns along the perimeter walls, but does not melt the ice. Enoch doesn't try to explain that. He just records it, the way a first responder writes what they saw without editorializing. Outside the structure, pillars of superheated water rise from vents in the ocean floor, glowing orange and red in the surrounding darkness. He describes the sound as constant, a low, sustained roar, like something pressurized and contained. The door is set into the ice wall on the side facing away from the vents. Enoch writes that he reached toward it and Uriel stopped him. No explanation given, just do not touch it. There is one more detail from the same passage that Western editions strip out entirely. The Ge'ez text adds that the door has no handle on the outside. It can only be opened from within. Enoch notes this without comment. Ariel doesn't explain it. The text moves on, but the implication sits there. Whatever is inside is not trying to get out, or it cannot. Either way, the door was not designed for a visitor. It was designed for a warden. And then comes the part the translators removed. The standard English editions of Enoch, including R.H. Charles's 1906 translation, that most people still reference, render chapter 17 verse 8 as, I saw the treasuries of the winds, treasury of winds, abstract, poetic. The Ge'ez manuscript in Aksum is more specific. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, noted in a private correspondence later archived at the University of Manchester that the Ge'ez phrase is Adar Nafas, which carries a secondary meaning, the reservoir of breath, not winds in the meteorological sense. The breath of living things, stored, held. The full passage, he wrote, implies the place beneath the ocean contains something alive that is still breathing. Here's what the translators left out. That phrase, the reservoir of breath, appears one more time in Enoch. Chapter 61, verse 5, uses the same Ge'ez construction to describe the breath of the righteous dead being preserved until resurrection. Same word, same construction. Two different contexts. In chapter 61, it's the breath of souls awaiting resurrection. In chapter 17, it's the breath of whatever is sealed beneath the ocean floor. The parallel is exact. The text is using resurrection language to describe the contents of a deep-sea prison. What modern readers don't realize is how specifically this matches what oceanographers have found at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. In 2020, a team at the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology drilled sediment cores from the ocean floor of the South Pacific Gyre, the most lifeless region of the deepest ocean on Earth. They found something alive inside the cores, microbial cells, dormant, buried under more than 200 feet of sediment, in rock layers over 100 million years old. The cells were still metabolically active. They were still breathing, still consuming oxygen, at a rate so slow that one breath, by their measurement, takes 10,000 years. The lead researcher, Dr. Yuki Morono, described the organisms as existing in a state that had no scientific category, not alive in any normal sense, not dead, just waiting. Enoch wrote this around 200 BCE. In 2020, scientists found living things beneath the ocean floor, metabolizing at rates that make a human lifetime look like a blink, sealed in sediment that formed before the dinosaurs existed. The text describes living things sealed beneath the ocean that are still breathing. The science found living things sealed beneath the ocean that are still breathing. The parallel is not metaphorical, it is structural. The implications of the Morono study were significant enough that a second team, this one from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, conducted a follow-up survey in 2022. They drilled sediment cores from the North Pacific and found the same thing. Living cells. Ancient, dormant, still metabolizing. The Woods Hole team published their results in Nature Microbiology and noted that the organisms showed genetic markers unlike anything in the surface biosphere. They were not surface life that had sunk to the floor and adapted. They were something else. The paper's authors described them as representing a previously unknown branch of life that has been isolated from the surface world for geological timescales. Isolated, sealed, alive, a previously unknown branch. Enoch said the same thing in different language 2,000 years earlier. He said what is down there is not like what is up here. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Church leaders removed Enoch from the biblical canon and called it dangerous. The specific problem with chapters 17 through 19 was geographical. The church's cosmology placed the abyss below the earth, beneath the land. Enoch placed a prison below the ocean, different location, testable claim. If the prison is under the ocean, someone could look for it. That made the text threatening in a way that purely symbolic apocalyptic writing was not. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed Enoch's ocean chapters as confused accounts of creation unworthy of serious study. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, argued the ocean abyss passages were borrowed from pagan sea mythology. Neither man addressed the geological specifics. Neither explained why Enoch knew the ocean floor was made of dark, smooth stone. The Ethiopian Church, operating independently of Rome, kept Enoch in its canon. When the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 Ge'ez manuscripts to Europe in 1773, the ocean chapters attracted immediate theological controversy. Oxford scholars who examined them called the deep sea prison passages irreconcilable with Mosaic cosmology in an 1821 review. R.H. Charles, producing his 1906 English translation, added a footnote suggesting the ocean house of ice was probably a garbled memory of Arctic exploration. No ancient Judean writer had been to the Arctic. Charles had no explanation. He offered one anyway. There is one more layer to the suppression that most researchers miss. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were first cataloged in the early 1950s, the ocean floor chapters of Enoch were assigned to the lowest publication priority. The scholars managing the scroll publication project, a team coordinated by the École Biblique in Jerusalem, divided the fragments into categories. Fragments touching on law, calendar, and community rules were published first. Fragments touching on cosmology, angiology, and geography were placed in the final category. The Enoch fragments describing the ocean prison sat unpublished for over 30 years after their discovery. They finally appeared in 1976, when Joseph Milik released his edition, and even then his commentary described the ocean floor passages as mythological elaborations without geographical content. The man who spent decades studying these texts dismissed the most specific geographical passage in the entire Enochic corpus as content-free mythology. But what the standard translation hides is this. The Aksum manuscript contains a passage in chapter 17 that does not appear in any Western edition. Access to the Aksum manuscripts was restricted after 1974, following the Ethiopian Revolution, when the new government classified church archives as national cultural property. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the foremost living authorities on Enoch scholarship, applied for access in 1988, denied. He applied again in 1997, denied. In a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review, Vanderkam stated that at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known to scholars through secondary references, but have not been available for direct examination in over 50 years. Now here's where it gets active. In 2019, a Norwegian oceanographic research vessel called the Kronprins Haakon, operated by the Institute of Marine Research, conducted a deep-sea survey of a geologically anomalous region in the South Atlantic, approximately 800 miles west of Namibia. The survey detected acoustic signatures at a depth of 4 miles that the ship's instruments could not classify. The lead researcher filed a preliminary report with the Norwegian Research Council describing the signals as inconsistent with known geological or biological sources at that depth. The report was classified as a restricted internal document. A summary was published in 2021, with the acoustic data section redacted. 2 requests under Norwegian Freedom of Information law to access the full report have been declined. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying there are ancient supernatural beings sitting in a palace of ice at the bottom of the Pacific, still breathing, waiting for the end of the world. The Book of Enoch is not a submersible mission briefing. But what the text describes when you read it carefully matches what modern deep ocean science keeps finding. Living things in the deepest, darkest, coldest parts of the ocean floor, metabolizing in slow motion, sealed under layers of rock and sediment, not dead, not alive in any normal sense, just persisting. Enoch had no submersible, no sediment drill, no sonar, no way to know anything about the ocean below a few hundred feet. He should not describe a sealed structure on a dark stone floor with pillars of fire beside it containing something that breathes. And yet the text sits there in Ge'ez and Aramaic, in fragments found at Qumran, in manuscripts locked in a church in Aksum, saying what it has said for over 2,000 years. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the ocean floor is made of dark, smooth volcanic basalt, if hydrothermal vents shoot fire upward from that floor, if dormant living organisms exist sealed beneath centuries of sediment in the deepest ocean, and if a text written before the Roman Empire describes all of that in plain language alongside a sealed prison containing beings that are not dead, then the text is not mythology. It is documentation. Enoch went somewhere, or was shown something, that gave him knowledge no person in 2000 BCE should possess. He recorded it with the same matter-of-fact tone you'd use writing a property deed. The chamber he describes: dark stone floor, walls of fire, house of ice. The door that cannot be opened is either a symbol we have misread for 22 centuries, or it is exactly what Enoch says, a real structure in a real place, beneath the real ocean, containing something that is still sealed, still breathing, and still waiting for the moment the door opens. The manuscripts remain in Aksum, inaccessible behind church walls and government restriction. Fragment 4Q206 sits in Jerusalem under glass. The sediment cores from the South Pacific Gyre are cataloged in a laboratory in Japan. The acoustic data from the South Atlantic sits in a redacted file in Oslo. And in a text the church removed from the Bible 17 centuries ago, a man named Enoch stands at the edge of a dark ocean floor, shown a sealed door by an angel, told it will not be opened until the judgment. The door is still there, the seal is still intact, and whatever is inside is still breathing, exactly the way Enoch said it was.
The Americas. Two vast continents coated with the ruins of ages gone by. From the sweltering marshes of the Mississippi, across the plains of Mexico, amidst the rainforests of the Amazon, to the highest peaks of the Andes. Storied and advanced ancient civilizations once called these lands home, with roots firmly embedded deep in the mists of time, many thousands of years ago, with the likes of the pyramid-building Norte Chico of the Peruvian coastline, and the mysterious Olmecs of the Mexican lowlands. Until the arrival of European disease in the 16th century, city-building agricultural societies with rich, intricate worldviews held sway. Philosopher kings of the Maya, vast cities of the Mexica Aztecs, home to hundreds of thousands, and their neighbors locked in bitter, eternal war. Mysterious Nazca of the coastal deserts, gold-rich metal workers of modern-day Colombia, and, of course, empire-building Inca of the Peruvian mountains. But what about the cultures that thrived in areas so remote, so untouched, that we barely know anything of their existence today? The Amazon is one example. Legends of lost cities in the forest, along with endemic, domesticated trees and plants, suggesting a landscape once entirely moulded and managed by human hands. Now almost entirely gone due to the acidic properties of the forest. But this isn't the only pristine rainforest found on the two continents. There is another place, even more remote and untouched, almost entirely unpopulated by humans. This is Mosquitia in eastern Honduras. 32,000 square miles of rainforest, broken up by mountain, lagoon, rivers and swamps. Located right on the ecological hotspot of the equator, one of the last unexplored places on the planet. Even in 2020, hundreds of miles of this wilderness remains uninvestigated scientifically. A potential treasure trove of previously unknown plants and animals. Many of the ones that we do know, however, are not friendly. with good reason. Early European cartographers called this place the Gates of Hell. Barbed plants here can tear flesh from bone. The fer de lance, killer of more people in the Americas than any other snake, stalks through the long grass. Poisonous spiders, scorpions, and bullet ants swarm on the forest floor. Even more deadly, disease-ridden sandflies and mosquitoes infest wherever they can. And, of course, this is a perfect habitat for jaguars, one of the world's most powerful apex predators, and one with a taste for human flesh. Even the landscape itself seems hostile to modern people, regularly beset by flash floods, sodden with pools of quicksand that can swallow a person whole. Even for veteran jungle explorers coated in protective clothing and hacking away with machetes, progress here is agonizingly slow-paced. But, as we shall see, it wasn't always this way. For centuries, stories have been told of a great lost city out in this rainforest. Often said to be encased in walls of white stone. This legend of the Ciudad Blanca, the White City, is one that many Hondurans hear as children. Often said to be a cursed place. Sometimes watched over by colossal statues of monkey deities. Far-fetched this may seem, yet, like the South American tale of El Dorado, a half-remembered nod to the Muisca people of North and South America, there is some truth to the tale. Clearly evident by small statues and carvings brought out of the forest over the years. In a subject mired in controversy, from time to time, locals claim to have visited this lost city, as well as all manner of outside expeditions launched over the years to find it. But, of course, it isn't easy to travel in Honduras, a place known for many years as the murder capital of the world. Since independence from Spain in the early 19th century, this small Central American nation has suffered more than most. At least 300 rebellions, coups, civil wars, and outside invasions conspiring to hinder its development at every turn. Today, it remains one of the most economically unequal countries in the world. Corruption remains rife, and conflicts rage between government and gangster warlords. In the 1990s, when Pablo Escobar's cocaine empire, itself having a higher GDP than most nations on Earth, collapsed under onslaught by the Colombian military, much of the trade lurched north into Central America. The Mesquite region, in particular, becoming a prime corridor for smugglers. Every year, vast amounts of cocaine are transported directly from here into the United States, and cartels rule much of the surrounding countryside and towns. Gangster warlords with an iron grip. Though officially under the protection of the Honduran government, since being declared a World Heritage Site in the 1980s, in reality, state control rarely extends deep into this area, and illegal deforestation continues at a rapid pace, hacking further and further into this lost world. Its treasures disappearing into the black market and collections of wealthy private buyers. The neighbouring Maya, located mere kilometres away, are amongst the most studied cultures of the New World. The culture of Musketia, however, remains amongst the very least. Embodied by the legend of the White City. This culture is so little known, it hasn't even been given a formal name. Because the region is so perilous, the Honduran government rarely issues permits for archaeologists to visit here, let alone anyone else. Nevertheless, over the last decade, using military-grade laser technology, the greatest advance in archaeology since carbon-14 dating, astonishing revelations have been made. Surveys from the sky revealing not just one lost city, but an entire city-building civilization. Occupying thousands of miles of eastern Honduras, at the ancient crossroads between Mesoamerica and the powerful Chibchan civilizations to the south. Isolated now, once this place was at the center of continent-spanning trade routes from north to south. This isn't Aztec, it isn't Maya, it's something else entirely. Until the last couple of years, not one of the sites of this ancient civilization has been comprehensively mapped, and next to nothing was known about them. Until now. In 2015, one of their sites on the banks of an unnamed river, known simply by its researchers as Target 1, was visited for the first time in 500 years. In 2016, another one known as Target 3 was visited too. Although some traces of the outside can be seen, like a potential ball court, a cultural import from Mesoamerica, and potentially the Chibchan language of the people to the south, such as the Muisca of modern-day Colombia. This was otherwise unrelated to these neighbouring cultures in architecture, culture, and society. Today, as cattle ranches get ever closer and deforestation continues, this whole area is still in grave danger of being lost, its secrets disappearing onto the black market. This is a story that has already spanned centuries, and it isn't over yet. Not by a long shot. This video is sponsored by a long-time supporter of the channel, and a personal favourite of mine, the Great Courses Plus. Here you can find more than 11,000 lectures on practically any subject you can think of, in both audio and video format, by the leading experts in the world. You can access all of it seamlessly on your phone, your tablet, and your computer. This is a university-level education at a fraction of the price, and one of my go-to sources for information whenever I'm researching a new topic. One course amongst many that I enjoyed recently is The History of the Ancient World, A Global Perspective by Professor Gregory Aldrete. Whether you're an expert or a complete beginner, these courses are for you. You can help me out and get yourself some free knowledge by signing up today to a free trial of the Great Courses Plus by clicking on my link in the description below, or by going to thegreatcoursesplus.com/historytime. It's 1526. 5 years have passed since the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Shattered empire of the Aztecs left crumbling in their wake. And now the architect of that campaign, Conquistador Hernán Cortés, is anchored off the coast of Honduras with the remnants of his army. The years hadn't been kind to Cortés, and now the grizzled adventurer was facing off against his own men. bickering over the spoils of their victory. Writing to the King of Spain, Cortés attempted to redeem his prestige by suggesting an entirely new region to conquer that he'd heard of from the locals. Not far inland from his anchorage on the Honduran coast.
I have trustworthy reports of very extensive and rich provinces, and of powerful chiefs ruling over them, ascertaining that it lies 8 or 10 days' march from the town of Trujillo, or rather between 50 and 60 leagues. So wonderful are the reports about this particular province that even allowing largely for exaggeration, it will exceed Mexico in riches and equal it in its largeness of towns and villages, the density of its population, and the policy of its inhabitants.
According to Cortés, the natives he spoke to called it the Old Land of the Red Earth. And though ultimately nothing came of the letter, it is perhaps the earliest mention of the Mesquite civilization. "20 years later, a Spanish priest, Cristobal de Pedreza, fated to eventually become the first bishop of Honduras, claimed to have travelled deep into the jungles of Mesquite on one of his missionary journeys, accompanied only by native guides. At one point along the trek, he wrote of coming upon a marvellous sight. From a high cliff, looking down upon a large and prosperous city spread out in a river valley. His guides told him the people here ate from plates of gold. Unlike his predecessors, however, Pedraza wasn't interested in gold, but the hearts and minds of the Native Americans. And no further expeditions were made, though his report to the king no doubt further added to the stories of untouched cities in the interior. For 300 years to come, these legends circulated, merging with indigenous ones to become something entirely new. Much of Honduras, in the meantime, becoming well populated by Spaniards and those with mixed ancestry known as mestizos. But not the interior of the East, remaining a sparsely populated land of indigenous people, unwilling to give up their secrets. By the 1830s, a civil war tore through Central America. The first proper investigation of its archaeology began. Travel writer John Lloyd Stephens and his illustrator companion Frederick Catherwood travelled south to Guatemala to try and find the ancient cities long spoken of in the forest. Slipping away from their official government minders to go out on their own, accompanied, of course, by native guides, it wasn't long before the two men walked in the footsteps of the Maya. Locating the once mighty city of Copan, overgrown since the 1200s, inhabited now only by monkeys and macaws. The importance of this journey cannot be overstated. Up until this point, ever since their numbers were annihilated by disease in the 1500s, Native Americans were generally seen as little more than savages, with no real history of their own. Walking amongst the colossal ruins of the past, once home to as many as 25,000 people, Stephens and Catherwood sought to change that. Nevertheless, an enterprising man of his time, Stephens bought the site setting about ultimately aborted plans to have the entire city dismantled and brought north to be displayed in the United States. This never happened, but American fascination with the area, and often direct involvement, continues to this day, uncovering hundreds upon hundreds of similar Maya sites. Yet, Copan was in fact at the very edge of Maya territory. Vast forested mountains to the east, proving a very real geographical barrier to further expansion. Glimpses of an ancient, non-Maya indigenous people could be seen at the city and in these regions beyond, but still little concrete was known. How far the Maya domain stretched could still not yet be ascertained, and of course stories continued to abound of lost cities still waiting to be found, even wealthier than these. Perhaps Maya, perhaps something else entirely. By the 20th century, these stories had coalesced into a single legend, Ciudad La Blanca, the legend of the White City. In August 1940, just as America teetered on the verge of joining the New World War, two disheveled explorers emerged from the rainforests of eastern Honduras. 4 months earlier, funded by a rich American financier, they'd disappeared into the depths of the Mesquite in search of the fabled lost White City said to exist there, embarking on what was then called the Third Honduran Expedition. Re-entering the modern world, laden down with a rich collection of artifacts, amazingly, they claimed to have found it. Those two men were Theodore Maud and Lawrence C. Brown, and during the media frenzy that followed, Maud gave a radio interview in New York on September 10th, one which changed the legend forever. I have just returned from the discovery of a lost city. We went to the region of Honduras that had never been explored. We spent weeks poling tediously up tangled jungle streams. When we could go no further, we started hacking a path through the jungle. Just as we were about to give up, I saw from the top of a small cliff something that made me stop in my tracks. It was the wall of a city, the lost city of the monkey god. I couldn't tell how large the city was, but I know it extended far into the jungle, and probably 30,000 people once lived there. But that was 2,000 years ago. All that was left were those mounds of earth covering crumbled walls where houses once stood, and stone foundations of what may have been majestic temples. I remembered an ancient legend told to us by the Indians. It said that in the lost city, a gigantic statue of a monkey was worshipped as a god. I saw a great jungle-covered mound, which, when someday we can excavate it, I believe may reveal this monkey deity. Maud goes on to describe the innumerable carvings of monkeys he found throughout the region, along with native legends of half-man, half-ape hybrids living out in the wilderness. Refusing to reveal the location of the city for fear of looting, Maud went on to serve as a spy during the Second World War. Before, in 1954, sunken into alcoholism and a failed marriage, never having returned to Honduras, he hanged himself. The curse of the monkey god claiming another victim, perhaps. Maud's story remains the most iconic of all expeditions into Meskhetiya. But it wasn't the first, nor the last. And as we shall see, his city probably never existed at all. His recently discovered private journals telling of his real motivations for heading into the forest. Gold. Theodore Maud, only 29 years old at the time, with a career as a journalist in the Spanish Civil War under his belt, was a con man, looking to make his fortune as a gold prospector. As the 20th century dawned, anthropologists and ethnologists began recording the stories and myths long told by the Pech people of northeastern Honduras, one of the indigenous peoples who live in the Meskhetiya. Despite repeated attempts, and though ravaged by wave after wave of disease during the 16th century, much of this region, then known as Taguascalpa, at times said to be a unified chieftain, had never truly been conquered by the Spanish. And the stories told by its Pech descendants may hold vital clues to its rich archaeological past. One prevalent legend is of a Caja Camasa, or White House, said to lie beyond a remote pass in the mountains of Meskhetiya, at the headwaters of two rivers. Often described as a refuge for retreating shamans to flee from the Spanish conquest, never to be seen again. Others hold that the Spaniards did in fact make it to the White City, only to be cursed by the devil, killed or lost forever. The devil, no doubt, meaning the gods of old, the Pech having been Christianized by this time. Others still describe the place as a tragic one, struck down by a series of catastrophes, its inhabitants, fearing the anger of the gods, abandoning it. Anyone who entered afterwards ending up cursed, dying of sickness, or killed by the devil. Of course, like any good story, this tale grew in the telling, with Americans like Maud adding their own embellishments to it. A variety of explorers, entrepreneurs, and even aviators like Charles Lindbergh began to tell tales of seeing buildings and settlements of stone out in the forest, ruined cities in the Meskhetiya. Eventually, all of these disparate tales and stories converged to become one standardized account of the White City, and by Maud's time, the lost city of the monkey god. The first known Westerner to explore the Meskhetiya was Luxembourgian ethnologist Eduardo Consemius. Moving deep up the Platano River by canoe, traditional way people moved around this wild land, Consemius headed to the place where rivers have no name. On the trail of the White City of Stone, said to have been discovered by a local rubber planter some 25 years earlier. The man was said to have died soon afterwards, according to his somewhat apprehensive native guides, killed by the devil for daring to look upon the place. Quite understandably, the people living on the edge of the wilderness remained reluctant to show Consemius around. Ultimately, he left, disappointed. By 1933, Honduras, often then known as the Banana Republic, had been infiltrated by American big business for decades. A cash cow being milked of all its worth. Enter William Duncan Strong, the first known American to enter the Meskhetiya. Thankfully, not a tycoon, but a meticulous scholar. The first to extensively study and record what he found in the region. Very much in the tradition of the great 19th century scientist explorers, without any modern bug spray or malarial medicine, as he headed inland along the Rio Patuca, Strong kept meticulously recorded journals, packed with illustrations of the animals, artifacts, and landscapes he found. Over the next 5 months, Strong, a keen scholar of history, established definitively that the area had indeed been inhabited by an advanced ancient culture, seeming related to, but not Maya. He didn't only find sculptures, but entire settlements, which he carefully recorded as much as he could. We know them today as the Floresta Mounds, the city of Huancavelica, Las Crucitas de Ener, and Dos Quebrada. Unfortunately, all remain extremely remote and inaccessible today, and information on them difficult to come by. Strong came up with several important conclusions from his travels. The Maya had built with stone. This people had not. Instead, raising vast mounds and great earthen works, the details of which have long since rotted away. But why would they work with stone when they had access to such great building wood in the area? It's the same all over the world. Strong's discoveries raised more questions than answers. If these people hadn't built with stone, where had the stories of white walls come from? Naturally, his scholarship was largely ignored, and stories of the White City continued to circulate. Meanwhile, in the US, another American financier, George Gustav Hay, eventual stockpiler of probably the largest collection of Native American artifacts anywhere in the world, became so obsessed with the legend that he began putting preparations together to finance an expedition of his own. Co-funded by the British Museum in London, and led by one of its associates, Frederick Mitchell Hedges, the expedition soon set off. Though soon enough, Hay began to regret his choice of expedition leader.